I'm going to be reading now from a book called Facts and Fascism. Facts and Fascism was authored by a man named George Seldes, last name S-E-L-D-E-S. And Seldes, for those of you who may not be familiar with his name, was an early investigative reporter and sort of muckraker, an early anti-fascist researcher, and those of you who saw the movie Reds have actually seen George Seldes, because Seldes was one of those people who was in the movie Reds and was featured in various little excerpts that were carried in the movie Reds. Okay, now in the book Facts and Fascism, George Seldes quotes a small passage from Adolf Hitler's 1935 German edition of Mein Kampf, and specifically the passage I'm about to read you can be found on page 252 of the 1935 German language edition. And basically, Der Fuhrer, Corporal Hitler here, is talking about lying. Alrighty, now about lying, Hitler had the following thing to say. The size of the lie is a definite factor in causing it to be believed, because the vast masses of a nation are in the depths of their hearts more easily deceived than they are consciously and intentionally bad. The primitive simplicity of their minds renders them more easy victims of a big lie than a small one, because they themselves often tell little lies but would be ashamed to tell big ones. Such a form of lying would never enter their heads. They would never credit others with the possibility of such great impudence as the complete reversal of facts. Even explanations would long leave them in doubt and hesitation, and any trifling reason would dispose them to accept a thing as true. Something, therefore, always remains and sticks from the most impudent lies, a fact which all bodies and individuals concerned in the art of lying in this world know only too well, and therefore they stop at nothing to achieve this end. Basically, what we're going to be doing here over the course of the next 4 Tuesdays is presenting to you some of the features of the truth about the JFK assassination and some of the more glaring aspects of the big lie. For indeed, the official version of the assassination of President Kennedy, that Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone nut, alone and unaided, dispatched the president, is not only wrong, it is completely wrong, but all the major aspects of the official government-sanctioned version of the assassination of President Kennedy are physically impossible, and several of the most important points contradict somewhere between 3 and a half dozen major theorems of plane geometry.
Just to reiterate something, and I've been doing some talking on different shows in different places lately, and basically the thesis statement that I've been using, which parrots what Dave has just said, is that either you believe in the Warren Commission or you believe in the laws of physics. And there doesn't seem to be any middle ground between them. Before we go on and start to lay out some of the evidence and some of the background for, specifically, this is going to be a background show this Tuesday night, let me just touch on something that Dave offered, not tonight, but at another point as an analogy or a metaphor, let's say, for the Kennedy assassination, which I found very telling. And that is to view the actual event of the assassination of John F. Kennedy as being the narrow part of an hourglass, and the bell-shaped protuberances, if you will have it that way, on either side as being the antecedents and the ramifications, and to understand the assassination itself and to understand the ramifications of the assassination, what came of this major blow to American political reality, you have to understand some of the antecedents of those particular events, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, one of the first things, Dave, before we get into some of this information, a lot of our listeners who perhaps either through reading or just through the fact of their age are not familiar with some of the changes that went on in this country. If you were to tell them that as late as the 1930s that a socialist could garner a fairly large percentage of the vote in the presidential race in the United States, some people out there would probably find that ludicrous just as a concept. This, I think, and Dave, you can toss your own 2 cents in on this, I think that this is attributable largely to the fact that in the 1950s, the late 1940s, and the 1950s, that the left as a political force, as a responsible political force, one could say was basically stomped out in this country systematically and very thoroughly.
Not only the left as a political force, but beyond that, even the record of their actions has been almost completely eliminated. What we're going to be doing this evening is, of course, covering the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, that assassination was one of a number of events which basically sort of spread out like the ripples from a rock being thrown into a pond, spread out from 1917, when basically there was the first socialist country came into being, namely the Soviet Union came into being with the Bolshevik Revolution. That's inspired a great deal of fear and resentment in the non-socialist countries, who then basically began a series of actions. Some of them were diplomatic, some of them were military, to try and stifle the Soviet Union. The dominant industrialists throughout the non-socialist world were in close touch, and many of them were in close cooperation in order to provide not only funding but patent technology and technological know-how as well to Nazi Germany, in the hopes that Nazi Germany would prove to be the would trump the Soviet ace, so to speak, that basically the German military prowess would eliminate the one socialist country on the world. Now, of course, in World War II, that didn't happen.
Unfortunately for many of the Western industrialists, as far as they were concerned, and that is a long and somewhat heinous record of participation and outright, one could call it selling out one's own side, that we've detailed in some other programs, namely Uncle Sam and the Swastika here on KFJC.
Just the important thing to note about it is that there were many, many industrialists in the United States, and many of the most powerful names who were pro-Nazi. In other words, their sympathies were with fascism and not democracy, and that's a point we'll be taking up later on in the series.
Okay, now, also, lest anybody turning this show on mistake the point of what is going on here, it should be made very clear that neither Dave or I are offering a socialist viewpoint on this, and I don't think either Dave or I would qualify as socialists of any sort, much less communists. However, much of this, and this again is a very crucial thing to understand, many of the events of the Kennedy assassination are directly attributable to John F. Kennedy's position as president between the right wing of his own country, the fiercely anti-communist right wing of his own country, and his desires to open up the world to perhaps at least a slightly less tense mode of living between the Western democracies and the socialist countries of the eastern part of our planet. So this is a crucial thing to understand, and talking about socialism has nothing to do with political determination or political feelings as to what we think about them. It's simply a fact to be taken into account, and whenever possible, we are going to be documenting anything even faintly resembling an assertion, and anything that we're going to hand you as a fact, be assured that we will have done our very darndest to document it about 9 times over. We're also going to be providing names and source quotations and citing references on all of the stuff that we're going to be laying before you in the next 4 shows. Tonight, as mentioned, and then the next 3 Tuesdays, culminating on the 22nd, which of course is the anniversary of John F. Kennedy's death. Now, perhaps before we go to this tape segment, Dave, you'd like to introduce it.
Yeah, also just a general remark for the benefit of listeners who would like to follow up on some of the information we present. We're not pretending to give you all of the information that there is to be had about the JFK assassination. It's a massive subject, and indeed just the Kennedy assassination alone, that is the John Kennedy assassination, is more than enough work to occupy a whole lifetime, and a very devoted lifetime at that. Rather, what we're trying to do here is to make you acquainted with some of the more important aspects of the controversy surrounding President Kennedy's assassination. And we are, in particular, we're going to be focusing on the Kennedy assassination as a political event. We will describe the crime itself and highlight many of its important features, but rather than going through every single faulty witness or every piece of missing evidence or faulty evidence, and there are incredible numbers of both in the course of that have cropped up in the course of the investigation, because the official version is, as we said, is a big lie. Rather, we're going to go out of our way to try and show you the significance of the Kennedy assassination as a political event, as an occurrence which stemmed from a number of different actions that were taken, mostly at the end of, but even to a certain extent during the course of World War II, by key industrialists in this country in order to safeguard against the eventuality of socialism.
Now, the first person that we're going to be quoting from, and in fact this is going to be a tape of an earlier One Step Beyond broadcast where this material was offered on the air at KFJC for the first time. We're going to be quoting from a gentleman named L. Fletcher Prouty, and L. Fletcher Prouty was the focus officer for Air Force and CIA liaison.
His actual formal title was Air Force Focal Point Officer, and what this meant was that all CIA operations involving the use of aircraft or Air Force units had to go through Prouty, and this is a very important point because we're going to be dealing with two cases in which just such a requirement was necessary.
Yes, we're going to be dealing with Mr. Prouty's area of expertise and what he has to say about it. Now, one other crucial thing, now referring back to the Cold War and understanding the format or the frame within which these facts fit. Mr. Prouty, in his book, The Secret Team, subtitled The CIA and Its Allies in Control of the World, talks about the secret team, but more importantly, in the larger sense, talks about the fact that the Cold War allowed the American military and intelligence establishment to perpetuate itself as if it were still wartime. In other words, there is a massive difference, and some of you, if you will reflect on this, will realize there is a massive difference between the powers that a military and an intelligence outfit is given during wartime than what it is given during peacetime. And the promulgation, if you want to use such a big word, or one could call it the incitement and of the Cold War, acted as an excuse for the intelligence agencies and the military establishment to keep themselves in a position of essentially making the final decisions on American foreign policy and American domestic political philosophy in a lot of ways as to what kind of resistance was dangerous and was cottoning to the enemy and things of this nature, which cropped up again in the later 1960s during the peace movement and other things. So anyway, just to understand that crucial point that the military and the intelligence establishments were playing prior to the election of John F. Kennedy in the political philosophy of the United States.
And of course, keep in mind that traditionally in the United States, the military, and this was specifically designated by the framers of the Constitution, that the United States was to have a civilian commander-in-chief over its armed forces, and that the final word on the commitment of military forces by the country was to be with the civilian sector. So keep that in mind. Now, one brief point before we proceed here. We're going to be presenting a lot of material in a very scholarly fashion. A lot of the material we're going to be presenting is excerpted directly from secondary and sometimes primary sources, like the book segment that we're about to give you here. Those of you who are in a position to do so may want to tape this and the succeeding broadcast so you'll have a record of the information for yourself and can go back over it later or play it for other people. Now, the first segment that we're going to be presenting comes from a book called The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty. Why don't you give us the publisher and a publication date. It was copyrighted 1969, and in softcover it was published by Ballantine Books. So The Secret Team, CIA and Its Allies in Control of the World, authored by Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, softcover Ballantine, 1969.
Okay, and this tape is originally excerpted from the One Step Beyond of September 4th, 1983. The fate of the world hung in the balance somewhere between these earnest plans for peace, they're talking about the summit conference, and the miles remaining ahead of that U-2, Francis Gary Powers plane, as it neared Sverdlovsk. This was not the normal U-2 flight. Much was made of the fact that the pilot had with him a vial, a needle of poison, so that rather than expose his native land to charges of willful violation of the airspace and sovereignty of the Soviet Union, he could silence himself in death. The code of the spy. Yet little was made of the antithetical fact that the pilot also had a parachute which would save his life. Much was made of the fact afterwards that this was a, quote, civilian aircraft, and that it was flown by a, quote, civilian pilot. Yet this pilot had been permitted to carry with him on this flight his military identification card, complete with name and picture, along with a pocketful of other identifying cards, all of which easily placed him at military installations, in military instrument flight schools, and on military facilities just days before the flight. He was hardly a deniable spy. Much was made later of the fact that Air Force Captain Powers had resigned from the Air Force, and that he was a civilian employee of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. He was technically a civilian, but his records were still held by the Air Force, and had he chosen, he could have returned to the Air Force without loss of pay, seniority, and promotion status. Furthermore, the number of identification items that he had with him made it clear that he was less a true civilian and more a civilian cover spy pilot. He was in the same mold as Alan Pope in 1958, who was captured by the Indonesians, and of the Air Force crew that was shot down in Armenia, also in 1958. By that time, the Russians had plenty of evidence to know that, quote, civilian pilots belonged to the CIA by way of the U.S. Air Force. This course of events had more impact upon the United States than upon the Soviet Union. The U.S. government made much of the fact that the U-2 was, quote, an unarmed civilian aircraft, and that it was flown by a civilian. However, in his book, The Craft of Intelligence, Alan Dulles makes much of the fact that the operation of such sophisticated aircraft could scarcely have been kept a secret. It wasn't. As he wrote, quote, "Sooner or later, certainly this would have leaked out. Since this was so certain, then why did the U.S. government have to give out untrue cover stories? And why do they have to permit Powers to carry so much identification when it would have been better to limit the leak as much as possible? Even if he had died, they would have had all the information they needed. How did it happen that they broke with policy procedures for that special flight by letting him take off loaded with incriminating evidence that proved he was a U.S. spy pilot? Who was it who wanted this special U-2 flight on May 1st, 1960, 2 weeks before the summit conference, to fail, and then to become so glaring an admission of guilt when it did fail that it would inevitably doom the summit conference along with it? The incidents of these things, too many things, give weight to the thought that this flight was intended to be something rather special. Nothing was said that all clandestine operations personnel, and especially the select coterie of U-2 pilots, were required to submit to a complete inspection before takeoff, which included the removal of all clothes and other personal effects, and the issue of sanitized, non-identifiable clothing and equipment sufficient only for the flight. Neither pilot nor plane were sanitized on this flight, as was required on other flights. Skipping on down. When the plane went down, its signals faded, and it was lost from tracking radar. The engine had stopped, and Powers was gliding the plane down from its extreme altitude, which was so high that the air's oxygen content was insufficient to support combustion. The normal combustion of the jet engine at that altitude had to be assisted by the infusion of a trace of raw hydrogen from a small liquid hydrogen cryogenic storage bottle. If by some chance the engine either coughed itself out, or if something happened to this slight hydrogen supply and the engine flamed out, it could not be restarted at that altitude. The pilot would have had no recourse other than to let down and see if he could restart the engine at some lower altitude. The evidence that the engine would not restart even at 30,000 feet indicates that the trouble was most likely hydrogen deficiency and not a normal fuel flameout. Had it been a simple flameout and had there been plenty of hydrogen, the engine should have restarted, as others had in similar circumstances. When the plane did not restart, Powers was forced to let it continue to spiral toward the Earth, and then at a safer altitude either bail out — a high-altitude bailout is dangerous and violent — or continue on down to the ground. Actually, some of the early pictures of the U-2 showed an aircraft that was relatively undamaged, when one considers that the Russian story was that it was hit by a rocket in the air and then crashed into the ground. We may never really know whether Powers parachuted because he was hit by Russian rockets or gunfire, or whether he parachuted simply to leave a plane that was doomed to crash anyhow. The elaborate pictures of the plane, which the Soviets released at the trial, show neither bullet damage nor rocket damage. Although at that point neither would be important. The plane was going to come down. If it had not been on the way down, neither rockets nor bullets would have been able to bring it down in those days. Okay, skipping ahead. The Russian premier, this is of course Nikita Khrushchev, was ready to say, quote, "We are so close to the summit and to peace. I am ready to accept that this was a cruel and terrible provocation made by others without the knowledge of the American president." Then, out of quotes, let the president stand up and say that he had no knowledge of this flight, and then back up his statement by firing Alan Dulles, Dick Bissell, and those other 4 men who had pressed so hard for this flight. This was the challenge, and that was the price. There was still a chance that Ike could have his long-dreamed-of summit conference, but now he would have to pay the price. Thus, Eisenhower was put to the biggest test of his entire career. Could he clean house? Could he rid the country of those who, as Harry Truman said, quote, had diverted the CIA to become the center of foreign intrigue? Or would he have to bend to their might and their cunning and see his dreams shattered in a cold and cruel awakening? Many years later, it was President Richard M. Nixon who said, quote, "When you inherit a nightmare." And that was as far as he went with his thought. President Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs, had the same nightmare. President Eisenhower had come within 2 weeks of achieving not only the goal of an aging president who had given his entire adult life to his country, but of realizing the hope of the entire country for a lasting and hopeful peace. No one will ever know just why he turned down Khrushchev's gambit. No one will ever know why he decided to back the ST at a time when it had permitted his plans to be shattered. Did he simply believe that his course was the only honest way out and that someone in his administration had made an innocent mistake? Or did he succumb to a greater pressure? It was not only the U-2 that had trapped him. The ST had armed and equipped a major force of tens of thousands of Tibetans high beyond the Himalayas. Now, the ST refers to the secret team, and this is the policymakers at the top of the military and the intelligence monoliths, I guess you could call them. It was not only the U-2 that had trapped him. The ST had armed and equipped a major force of tens of thousands of Tibetans high beyond the Himalayas. It had thousands of Cubans under arms and in training all over the North American continent, from the Canal Zone to many sites in the United States. It was deeply entwined in the politics and economy and rebellions of Africa, and already the United States, which had seldom seen armies in its own streets, was becoming accustomed to the roar of heavy trucks and the march of feet in embattled inner cities. Did Eisenhower really have a choice? Could he just fire Allen Dulles and a few of his top lieutenants and clean house that simply? He knew that he could not. Those other men who had seen to it that all the little things fell into place, and that the U-2 had gone aloft on that precise day, were men of the secret team, and wiping out Dulles and his staff would not touch them. Furthermore, it was one thing to have the power to see that the U-2 was not stopped from going on a rather routine flight, but it was an entirely different matter to be able to assure that it would come down in the very center and heart of the Soviet Union. Skipping ahead for the last part we're going to read here. The president may have realized that he was not really in charge of events, and he could not honestly say that he didn't know what was going on. Yet he had never seen the picture in its totality before. There was no other way out. President Eisenhower did the only thing he could. He announced to the world that he had known about the flight and that it had been his sole responsibility as Commander-in-Chief of the United States. With that, Khrushchev had no choice but to face the same facts his way. How could he hope to reach a peaceful settlement and meaningful agreements with a president who was admitting to the world that at the very time he had been speaking peace, he had been plotting overflights and the invasion of the territorial integrity of not only the Soviet Union, but of China and Tibet and Cuba? Khrushchev had no alternative either. All hopes for a successful summit conference had gone. The leaders of the world attended the conference individually, but all was lost. With this great disaster, the 15-year search for a peaceful settlement in a world menaced by the atomic bomb came to an end. Vietnam lay ahead. Now, that's a rather complicated bit of information, and probably, and to hearten those of you out there who are reeling from all the information on the U-2 spy plane, which you might not have been familiar with, that's probably the most complicated bit of information we're going to be laying on you in this show tonight, at least as far as getting in tune with things. To go back and touch some bases real quickly, Dave, you might want to explain about the U-2 and how it all came to pass in the first place, and some things relating to it later on, and how we're going to bring it back in.
Oh, okay. Now, the U-2 basically was put together by the CIA and Lockheed Corporation in order to fly over the vast territorial expanse of the Soviet Union and bring it all under U.S. surveillance. U.S. intelligence had been notoriously bad at getting agents inside the Soviet Union, so they turned to technology basically to solve that problem. And the U-2 had been flying for some time over the Soviet Union, performing espionage missions, and it's worth noting that the U-2 flew much higher than any existing plane, interceptor aircraft, or anti-aircraft guided missile that was possessed by either side in the Cold War at this point, so that there is no way that the Russians could have shot the plane down unless it went down to a lower altitude. Now, summing up very briefly what Prouty had to say there, so that the information is front and center. Basically, first thing, the summit conference basically was deep-sixed by the failure of the U-2. In other words, Khrushchev and President Eisenhower were going to be getting together and attempting to work out some sort of peaceful resolution to the Cold War. The U-2 scratched that. Now, President Eisenhower had given specific orders that no plane, no act be taken by any element in the U.S. military or intelligence apparatus to jeopardize the peace conference. Now,
let's also make a couple of other things clear real quickly, which is, first of all, President Dwight Eisenhower, despite his own military background, was the first person to warn the United States and its citizens formally about the military-industrial complex. Dwight Eisenhower, in fact, said that the greatest danger to the United States in the upcoming years would be the growing supremacy of the military-industrial complex in in its participation in national life and national policy making. Another key point, unless any of you out there have missed this, I want to make this clear, because since we jumped into the technicalities, we did not make the overall thesis of this as clear as it might have been. There is no doubt that there was spying going on both sides. The mere existence of the U-2 is not in and of itself the thing that we're pointing to. There is no doubt in anybody's minds that both sides were doing their best to spy on each other. What we are talking about here, and what Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher Prouty is in fact charging, is nothing less than a betrayal of the U-2 from within by what he calls the secret team. Again, the top men in intelligence and the military complexes. A betrayal of this particular U-2 flight from within, so to sabotage this upcoming conference. Okay, and that's specifically what we're talking about here. Not the spying itself, but the fact of the United States sabotaging its own spy mission to Deep Six, the summit conference.
Worth noting, of course, that already by 1959, the national security apparatus of the United States, or at least elements thereof, were already acting independently of the President's wishes and in direct contradiction of the United States Constitution. It's worth noting that one of the remarkable departures from standard operating procedure with the U-2 is the fact that someone obviously went out of their way to see to it that Francis Gary Powers would be very identifiable. None of the standard steps were taken to sanitize Francis Gary Powers, and Prouty also hints that a tampering with the hydrogen mechanism of the U-2 was responsible for its inability to maintain its altitude and consequent downing by the Soviets. And again, keep in mind that this was in direct contradiction of not only President Eisenhower's wishes and orders, but indeed in direct contradiction of the United States Constitution. And it's worth noting that the events surrounding the U-2 obviously were initiated by a very capable group of individuals. It certainly could not have been the work of one man.
Okay, another very important thing to realize while we're piling important things on top of you here is, as Dave said, the National Intelligence Network, specifically the CIA in this case, had long since become or considered themselves independent of the presidency. And another thing to remember here when we're talking about the CIA, except for the director who is appointed, we are talking about essentially a government civil service that knows no political affiliation in terms of being voted in or out of office. So a group that came in 1949 during the Red Scare were still around in 1959. Many of them were still around in 1969. Some of them were still around in 1979. God forbid, a few of them may still make it to 1989. So we're talking about a perpetual group, not a group of office holders voted in and out by the whims of the democratic public. Another important thing to realize is, as Dave said, not only had they become independent of Dwight Eisenhower, this goes clear back to the formation of the CIA and the inception of the CIA charter. The CIA, as many people fail to realize, a lot of people think the CIA is sort of like our intelligence army abroad, you know, fighting the Soviets, training radical groups, you know, to do this and do that. Well, that's in fact many things that they have become, but the CIA at its inception was supposed to be an intelligence gathering operation. The only part of the operation that was had any leeway as far as action was a very small subclause written in that the CIA could take whatever action was necessary in certain select circumstances to protect their intelligence sources. Well, the people in the secret team, if you want to put it that way, exploited this loophole to the point where the covert operations team, which was originally built on that tiny loophole, later became much superior in terms of clout within the CIA to the intelligence division itself, and in fact became the operant mode. And this is where quite a few of the people that have been termed as renegade agents or have been disavowed by the CIA in fact came from, and in fact most of them, many of whom are now called renegade agents, have continued to be members of the covert operations, but their very nature makes them covert operators. So this is something to bear in mind also. So clear back in the Truman days, at its very inception, the CIA had begun to break away from presidential control.
All right, now, going again back to the U-2, recall that the summit conference, which would have cemented détente between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, was Deep Six. Obviously, it was the work of some sort of organization, either the U.S. national security apparatus as a whole or a large and controlling segment thereof. Now, this is worth noting for our purposes because the pilot of the U-2, Francis Gary Powers, who basically was shot down, imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and then came back to the United States. Upon his return, he co-authored a book with a man named Kurt Gentry, and among the things he intimated in that book were the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, later incorrectly accused as the lone assassin of President Kennedy, is attributed, the downing of the U-2 is attributed to Lee Harvey Oswald by Francis Gary Powers and others.
The other thing to remember is, as stated in Colonel Prouty's book, the Russians, the Soviets, however you want to phrase it, could not have shot down the U-2 if it had not descended. In other words, that although, as we'll hear Powers say, that he thinks it was betrayed to the Soviets, at that point in time, technologically speaking, the Soviets could not have gotten up to get the U-2, even if they'd known exactly where it was flying. The U-2 had to come down before shots could even be fired at it.
No plane or missile could reach the standard cruising altitude of the U-2.
All right, so now we're going to be listening to another segment from the same One Step Beyond, and...
No, actually, this will be from the succeeding week. This will be September 11th.
Ah, okay, all right. My mistake then, and we're going to go ahead and listen to the One Step Beyond. There you go. Okay.
All right, now what we're going to be doing here is reading, basically you're going to hear Nip Tuck reading from a book called Operation Overflight. Now, Operation Overflight, as I just mentioned, was authored by Francis Gary Powers, who was the pilot of the ill-fated U-2 mission which scotched the impending summit conference. He wrote the book with a man named Kurt Gentry, last name Gentry. The book was published by Tower Books in paperback and copyrighted. Well, my Roman numerals are a ways behind us. I'm not even going to attempt the copyright date, but within the last 10, 12 years. So basically, Tower Books is the paperback edition. Operation Overflight by Francis Gary Powers and Kurt Gentry. This from the One Step Beyond show of September 11th, 1983.
57. The U-2s, that's the spy plane that Francis Gary Powers was flying, the U-2s were based in a new location at Sugi, Japan. In September of that year, a 17-year-old Marine Corps private was assigned to Marine Air Control Squadron No. 1, MACS-1, based at Atsugi. MACS-1, or MAX-1, was a radar unit whose duties included scouting for incoming foreign aircraft. Its equipment included height-finding radar. The private, a trained radar operator, had access to this equipment. He remained in Japan until November 1958, at which time he was returned to the United States and assigned to the Marine Air Control Squadron No. 9, MAX 9, at the Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro, California. El Toro was not a U-2 base, but U-2s frequently flew over this portion of Southern California. At El Toro, he had access not only to radar and radio codes, but also to the new MPS-16 height-finding radar gear. In September 1959, he obtained a hardship discharge from the U.S. Marine Corps. The following month, he defected to the Soviet Union. On October 31st, he appeared in the American Embassy in Moscow to state his intention of renouncing his U.S. citizenship. According to Richard E. Snyder, the second secretary and senior consular official, and John A. McVicker, Snyder's assistant, he mentioned that he had already offered to tell the Russians everything he knew about the Marine Corps and his specialty, radar operation. He also intimated that he might know something of, quote, special interest. His name, and longtime listeners of One Step Beyond have probably figured this out already, his name was Lee Harvey Oswald. 6 months later, says Francis Gary Powers, my U-2 was shot down. Oswald's familiarity with MPS-16 height-finding radar gear and radio codes, the latter were changed following his defection, are mentioned in the testimony of John E. Donovan, a former first lieutenant assigned to the same El Toro radar unit as Oswald, on page 298 of Volume 8 of the Warren Commission hearings. According to Donovan, Oswald, quote, had the access to the location of all bases in the West Coast area, all radio frequencies for all squadrons, all tactical call signs, and the relative strength of all squadrons, number and type of aircraft in a squadron. Who was the commanding officer, the authentication code of entering and exiting, which stands for the ADIZ, which stands for Air Defense Identification Zone. He knew the range of our radar. He knew the range of our radio. And he knew the range of the surrounding units' radio and radar, unquote. Oswald's conversation with Snyder is mentioned at least 3 times in the report of the Warren Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. Page 618. Oswald told him that he had already offered to tell a Soviet official what he had learned as a radar operator in the Marines. Page 665. Oswald stated to Snyder that he had voluntarily told Soviet officials that he would make known to them all information concerning the Marine Corps and his specialty therein, radar operation, as he possessed. Page 369. Quote, he stated that he had volunteered to give Soviet officials any information that he had concerning Marine Corps operations and intimated that he might know something of special interest. During the 6 months following the October 31st, 1959 embassy meeting, there were only 2 overflights of the USSR. The one which occurred on April 9, 1960 was uneventful. The one which followed on May 1st, 1960 wasn't. Here the trail ends, except for one tantalizing lead discovered during the research for this volume. Among the Warren Commission documents in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. is one numbered 931, dated May 13, 1964, CIA National Security Classification Secret. In response to an inquiry, Mark G. Eckhoff, Director, Legislative, Judicial, and Diplomatic Records Division, National Archives, in a letter dated October 13, 1969, stated, quote, Commission Document 931 is still classified and withheld from research. The title of document number 931 is, quote, Oswald's accessed information about the U-2. All right, so a brief segment from a book by Francis Gary Powers with Kurt Gentry, and his allegation, and it's a fairly subtle allegation, but the allegation is definitely there, that Lee Harvey Oswald, in fact, compromised and was responsible for the shooting down of the U-2. Now, a couple of facts that should be made clear very quickly. One, this book did come out well after the Kennedy assassination and the resulting brouhaha, so Oswald's name was not unknown at this point, and many other people were putting out things accusing Oswald of all variety of things. So it's not as if Francis Gary Powers can be given the nod for pinpointing Oswald ahead of the time. It was definitely part of a pattern.
That's important to note. This is a theme that's been sounded by the right in this country over a period of years. It's not hard to find articles attributing the downing of the U-2 and subsequent deep sixing of the summit conference to Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is interesting because now recall the material that Prouty presented about how Francis Gary Powers went on the flight with all kinds of identification, personal and organizational, which was done in direct contradiction of standard operating procedure. Recall the hint by Prouty that the hydrogen mechanism, which was used to restart the plane in the event of a flameout, had been deep sixed.
And the very flight itself was in contravention of Eisenhower's direct order as Commander-in-Chief not to compromise the summit conference, and that's a very important fact. I mean, that flight was put in the air deliberately in contravention of Eisenhower's order.
Notice that none of the information that Prouty talks about as being involved in the downing of the U-2 had anything to do with radar, any of the information that Francis Gary Powers charges Lee Harvey Oswald with being in the position to betray. And it's worth noting also that Richard Snyder, whom Oswald was interviewed, it later turned out was a CIA operative stationed at the Moscow embassy, and there are a number of sources for that, notably a book called Who's Who in the CIA by Julius Mater, but it's been well documented. And think about Oswald. Now, he supposedly had nothing more than an 8th grade education, and he was from the Marines. Now, could Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut who not only deep-sixed President Kennedy, could he also have deep-sixed a summit conference here? And, well, again, look at all the history that's being attributed to one man.
That's right. And while you're thinking about that, we're going to take a short musical break, and we are going to be back in just a matter of a few moments here with more on the subject of the Cold War and the hardening of the anti-Soviet attitude amongst the people at the top of the secret team and their influence directly on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. We're going to be talking about the Bay of Pigs when Dave Emory and myself, Nip Tuck, return in just a moment for a little more of the Guns of November. Dave, you had something that you specifically wanted to point out.
Yeah, okay. Reviewing really quickly, of course, we've seen how an impending summit conference between Soviet Premier Khrushchev and President Eisenhower was basically canceled against the wishes of President Eisenhower. This was so done by producing an incident which, quite obviously from the nature of the incident, could not have been done by one man. It obviously took certainly a large group, if not the entire U.S. national security apparatus, to pull such an operation, and yet we've seen this crime attributed, or this event, this crime I guess we could call it, attributed to Lee Harvey Oswald, and it's quite apparent that Lee Harvey Oswald certainly did not have the capabilities of performing such an action on his own. And the actions that he supposedly took were in direct contradiction of the Constitution and prevented détente. And it's worth noting that Francis Gary Powers, the fellow from whose book Nip just read via Oxide just a couple of minutes ago, when he was going to be questioned by, I believe it was the Senate Intelligence Committee about the U-2 incident, he died in the crash of the traffic helicopter that he was piloting, and he was an extremely experienced pilot, The official account for why his helicopter crashed was that he ran out of fuel. Certainly one wonders how such an experienced pilot could have done it. Eyewitnesses to the crash, however, said the helicopter exploded in midair. And this is worth noting because we're going to see an awful lot of untimely deaths befalling various figures connected with the Kennedy assassination.
And I think this is one of the key things that people have to deal with in terms of the one of the main things that we hear in response to the Kennedy assassination, the thesis that the fact that it was not a lone nut, and that in fact, if there was not a conspiracy from the beginning, there was certainly a conspiracy to cover up, and we feel that that can be proven without doubt, without exception. A lot of people have to get over the initial idea of it can't happen here, and one of the main things I think that will lock a lot of people onto the truth of this is when you see how many people who resisted the idea of Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin, whether out of personal information or out of a desire to find out more themselves or whatever, wound up dead rather suddenly, some of them rather violently. So that's something we're going to be talking about. One of the other things I want to make clear as we're moving along through the show tonight is that after we have finished with the information portion of the show tonight, which may be as much as another hour or so, we will be opening the phones. This show is going on until 10 o'clock tonight. We know that there are a lot of people out there who already have some expertise, but there are also undoubtedly a lot of people out there who are not familiar with this material at all and will want to ask questions or try out some theorems of their own or whatever the case may be. So after we finish the information part of the show, we will certainly be opening the phones. That is an integral part of our performance here tonight, is your part in that performance, so don't worry about that. Now, Dave, I think we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk a little bit about a subject that was very much on the minds of all the people on every side of the spectrum during the Kennedy days, and that is Cuba and its Premier Fidel Castro and its status as a pro or anti-U.S. country.
Of course, that's very much on people's mind these days, too. It's a subject that's occupied a lot of newsprint and a lot of thought time over the course of the last 20 years or so. Now, of course, in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba, and established a regime initially with United States help. It later turned out that Castro was a Marxist, and following the perhaps predictable United States reaction to that information, namely one of overt hostility, Fidel Castro turned to the Soviet Union for his support, and that basically forged the alliance which we've heard so much about through the years. Now, where we're going to begin picking up here is exactly, in a sense, where we left off before the music break. We're going to begin with the initiation of a U.S. intelligence operation against the specific directives of President Eisenhower, who preceded President Kennedy as president. And again, we're going to be looking at an operation which was put together without the president's knowledge and without his sanction by an insider's cabal, as Colonel Fletcher Prouty terms it. Now, again, we're going to be returning to the work of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who, for those of you who maybe just tuned in, Colonel Prouty was known as Air Force Focal Point Officer. He was a colonel in the Air Force, and what this meant was that he was the liaison officer between the Pentagon and the CIA on all CIA operations necessitating the use of aircraft or Air Force units. Now, this is significant for our purposes because the Bay of Pigs, as well as the U-2, involved such an operation. Now, the source where our information is coming from on this, I'd like to comment on it briefly. We're going to be talking about an article from Gallery Magazine. And now, Gallery Magazine is not generally one of the sources that we regard as a pillar of American journalism. This article was sent to me some years ago by a listener, and unfortunately I can't even cite you the exact issue of Gallery that this article comes from, because Gallery does not put the issue and date at the bottom or top of its pages. Now, the title of this particular article from Gallery Magazine is "The Betrayal of JFK Kept Fidel Castro in Power." It's by Colonel Prouty. It's clear from the context of the article that it took place fairly early in the Carter administration, but again, I can't give you an exact date of it. And for those of you who might be troubled by the use of Gallery Magazine as an information source, basically keep in mind that we're using this because of Colonel Prouty's expertise. Again, he was the liaison officer for all CIA operations involving Air Force units and was directly and highly placed in the chain of command for the U-2 operation, as we're going to discuss.
Okay, another thing about Colonel Prouty, since again it is his information that is important here, is that Colonel Prouty not only held one could say almost a critical position in the in the events that we've been talking about, the U-2 and the Bay of Pigs and things of that nature. But Colonel Prouty's veracity, as far as I know, nobody has ever been able to take him down. Many people have wanted to, because of course Colonel Prouty has put some thorns in some very highly placed sides, and nobody has ever been able to disprove any of Colonel Prouty's allegations as to these things going on.
Good point. Not only that, but Prouty has been sought out by both right-wing, far right-wing, and left-wing or left-of-center sources. So apparently his integrity and veracity transcends ideological boundaries. You'll see him quoted by far-right mercenary publications as well as by so-called radical elements, too. Now, before we get into this segment of tape here, basically this is going to be from a Hard Rain broadcast from June 3rd of 1981, almost 2.5 years ago. First, Nip has a comment here.
Yeah, I want to mention a couple of things, and this is very important because a lot of people, again, we're talking about a period in history that quite a few of our listeners were not of sufficient age to have been following at the time in terms of news and things going on, and that furthermore that since then has come almost entirely into the I would say under the auspices of people writing news and writing history, many of whom have chosen some rather lamentable shortcuts. A couple of very key things. The first is just, for instance, myself. I was just looking at a sociology textbook the other day, and they used the example of John F. Kennedy and his cabinet concocting the Bay of Pigs as being an example of group think, meaning inability of a group to make a correct decision because of a wish for unanimity or something of that nature. Anyway, as Colonel Prouty and other people have mentioned and have made clear in the past, this operation was planned long before John F. Kennedy was in office, long before it was even known that John F. Kennedy was elected to office. Okay, that's a critical point because people since have come to believe, because it's sort of just bandied around, that, well, of course, John F. Kennedy initiated the Bay of Pigs. Simply not true, but something, as I said, I just saw in an up-to-date sociology textbook. Another key point, and this, in fact, is, again, getting back to setting the stage into an understanding of what was going on in the United States at that time. As I mentioned, there was what could be called a corps of full-time civil service level intelligence operatives. In other words, people who had been in intelligence since perhaps World War II and would in fact devote their entire lives to clandestine intelligence. Now, not to tar them all with the same brush, but quite a few of these people have proven since to be just about devoid of human values. And I think that anybody who's watched, the Watergate hearings or the Church Commission hearings and things of this nature are quite aware of that. But now the key point, and the point I'm holding up this tape to make, is that the capture, if you will have it that way, of Cuba by Castro, in other words, the overthrowing by Castro of an extremely right-wing government, which even the U.S. supported in terms of the overthrow for a while, was when it was revealed that Castro was himself left of center, was a Marxist, was going to try and redistribute the wealth, etc., etc., and then later on, when he was rebuffed by the United States based on his political philosophies, and they had to make contacts with Russia, this was a thorn in the side of America's intelligence establishment, such as it has never seen before or since. I mean, Cuba is still a driving obsession for many people in clandestine intelligence. This is one of the reasons that the Reagan administration came in talking about Cuba as soon as they got into office, and the possibility that maybe we were going to start making things hot for Cuba again. The presence of a Marxist state 90 miles off the coast of Florida has been an obsession unequaled. And this is one of the main reasons that so many things having to do with clandestine intelligence, with renegade members of clandestine intelligence or pseudo-renegade members of clandestine intelligence, Watergate, assassinations, and a variety of other things often come back down to this Cuba lobby because it was a pivotal and a crucial point to the thinking of most American intelligence agents.
Now keep in mind the accurately stated antipathy of the United States towards Cuba, because the information that Prouty is going to be presenting here is going to be quite startling. To give you an idea of what you're going to be listening to here, because a lot of information is going to be run by you in a relatively short period of time, the most important thing about Prouty's presentation here is the fact that he maintains that it was the CIA itself, or an element thereof, specifically in the person of General Charles Cabell, who was deputy director of the CIA at the time, that it was the CIA itself which deliberately sabotaged its own covert operation in the Bay of Pigs, and, as the title, the betrayal of JFK kept Fidel Castro in power, that basically that that betrayal occurred by the CIA. Now, to tell you what you're going to be listening to, first of all, the first section here that Prouty is going to be talking about is going to deal with the fact that John F. Kennedy, when he was a presidential candidate, learned of what Prouty terms an insider's cabal to launch the Bay of Pigs operation. Now, this is important to note because just as we saw with the U-2 incident, the Bay of Pigs operation was undertaken by a group of the Cold War civil servants that Nip Tuck talked about just a few minutes ago. It was undertaken on their own against President Eisenhower's specific directives because he forestalled all action against Cuba until it could be better determined just what nature of fish Castro was. Then this insider's cabal, led by Richard Nixon, who was at the time vice president and in charge of the control group, in charge of all covert operations, basically, this insider's cabal went ahead on its own in direct contradiction of Eisenhower's wishes to plan the Bay of Pigs. Now, candidate John F. Kennedy penetrated this insider's cabal to a certain extent, learned of some of the impending plans for the invasion, and thereby ran afoul of this insider's cabal, including Richard Nixon, who we're going to talk about later, who was President Kennedy's 1960 opponent. He learned about this running afoul of that cabal even before he became president. Now, two terms that Prouty talks about here, which are absolutely essential for understanding the Bay of Pigs and understanding how the CIA deep-sixed its own operation, are the terms air cover and air support. Now, air support refers to action taken by warplanes against ground forces in support of one's own ground forces. Okay, air cover or air support is action taken by air forces against units on the ground on behalf or in support of one's own forces. Air cover refers to action by aircraft against opponent's aircraft. In other words, if you're staging a military operation and the enemy is coming at you with airplanes, you need aircraft of your own to provide air cover against the enemy's aircraft. Now, Kennedy has been faulted for not providing the Bay of Pigs invasion with air cover, without utilizing the Air Force itself to provide air cover for the Bay of Pigs operation. There were numerous appeals for air cover, which Kennedy quite correctly or quite accurately did turn down. Now, what Prouty points out and what isn't mentioned is that the original plan for the Bay of Pigs invasion would not have needed air cover. The CIA's air wing had put together a group of World War II B-26 bombers, which were outfitted with a very impressive array of machine guns specifically for use against ground targets. And U.S. espionage and reconnaissance had located all of Castro's Air Force, which was tiny. Now, the core of Castro's Air Force were 3 T-33 jet trainers of American manufacture, each of which were armed with some .50 caliber machine guns. Now, these planes, if they got into the air, would have been capable of trashing the B-26 propeller-driven planes that the CIA had provided for air support for the invasion. Now, because of this, a provision had been made for a preemptive strike by the CIA's B-26s on the T-33 jets, which had been located by U.S. reconnaissance. Now, it was General Charles Cabell, who, according to Prouty, was one of the major figures, along with Prouty himself, in the chain of command for Bay of Pigs, who deliberately scotched the order for the B-26s to attack the T-33s, thereby eliminating Castro's Air Force, and thereby eliminating the need for air cover. Okay, so this is the importance of the difference between air cover and air support. Had the CIA or an element thereof not deliberately deep-sixed its own operation, there would have been no need for air cover. So this is absolutely essential to keep in mind as you listen to Prouty's argument. And then keep in mind that as Air Force focal point officer, he was directly and highly placed in the chain of command, as we're going to see. So without further ado, here is the article from Gallery by Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty dealing with how the CIA deep-sixed the Bay of Pigs.
And you are listening.
Under Eisenhower, there never was a plan to invade Cuba. There may have been hope for it on the part of the Cubans, but the president had not sanctioned such an act. As a matter of fact, we had explicit orders not to become involved in any operation which in any way would carry over from the Eisenhower administration into the next administration, either Nixon or Kennedy. These orders were explicit and understood by all of us in the clandestine game during the crucial midsummer of 1960. Then, Senator Kennedy began to make his moves. JFK aimed for the presidency, and he was unique. He not only campaigned long and hard to weld together a knowledgeable, hard-hitting team, he also carried that team over into his administration. They began to dig into the clandestine dung heap. The magnetic Cuban speaker in Detroit, Manuel Artime, was the ace in the CIA's anti-Castro deck, but JFK got to him. On the very same day, Artime and his other Cuban inner-circle exiles were escorted into the Pentagon's super-secret Office of Special Operations, Office of the Secretary of Defense. On that very same day, those same Cubans were spirited away from the CIA into the office of Senator Jack Kennedy. JFK one-upped the CIA and the Pentagon and Nixon on Cuban affairs even before that crucial TV debate with Nixon. I'd like to interrupt here to point out something I neglected to mention in the introduction. Nixon was the head of the National Security Council group in charge of covert operations, which is how he came to be involved with what Prouty terms the insiders' cabal. Continuing here with Prouty's narrative, Kennedy didn't get all of the inside data, but he kept Nixon and the CIA cabal on their toes. By October of 1960, this insiders' cabal decided it was time to make several moves. If Nixon won the election, they would be well on their way with several major clandestine operations in full swing. If Kennedy won, the cabal might have enough momentum to overpower any deflecting moves he might make. And if the secret operations failed, Kennedy would be blamed because no one knew they were initiated before he became president. The word went out to step up the Cuban exile training in Florida, Louisiana, Panama, and Guatemala. Next, Prouty goes on to describe the tactical plan for the Bay of Pigs operation. As I mentioned before, the CIA's Air Division had provided for some propeller-driven B-26s to fly in support of the Cuban Exile Brigade, and that basically these were equipped with special armament to make them particularly potent against ground targets, and that the operation plan called for these planes to destroy all of Castro's Air Force, and especially Castro's U.S.-built T-33 jet trainers, which, though lightly armed, were so much more maneuverable than the propeller-driven B-26s the CIA brigade had, that basically the B-26s would have been no match for these T-33s. Now, as I said, the original plans were to knock out these T-33s, and Prouty goes on to describe the tactical situation as follows. Castro had a half-dozen B-26 aircraft, which, unlike the CIA B-26s, had no machine guns. They were light bombers. He had a few old British combat fighters called Sea Furies, and he had 3 T-33 jets. The T-33s each had 2 50-caliber machine guns. That was not much firepower, but with their high speed, those jets had a huge advantage over the CIA B-26s, and their 50-caliber guns were lethal. The Air Division plan called for the destruction of Castro's combat aircraft on the ground before the brigade hit the beach. This was an absolute must. Everyone knew that. Kennedy knew that. Allen Dulles knew that. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Lyman L. Lemnitzer knew that, and all the key CIA mission commanders knew that. The principal CIA combat commander was a U.S. Marine Corps colonel, and he knew that. If Castro's aircraft were destroyed first, there would be no need for air cover. The B-26s would be air support. On the Saturday before the Monday of the invasion, the Exile Brigade's B-26s had taken off to destroy the Cuban Air Force planes on the ground. They totaled the B-26s and the Sea Furies, but they did not find the T-33s. A U-2 was sent up to locate them. It found them parked wingtip to wingtip near Santiago, Cuba. They would easily be destroyed at sunrise on Monday. In the dark of that moonless night, the CIA mission commander in Nicaragua rode his bicycle toward those 4 B-26s. He signaled them to fire up their engines and stand by. Then he waited for the release from Washington, which would tell him all was going according to plan to send the bombers on their way. The commander knew the mission depended upon the success of this operation. He was ready, and the crack Cuban crews were raring to go. Their orders were to strike that small base where the T-33s were parked, coming in at sunrise with the sun at their tails and flying low to avoid possible radar and ground fire. Still later, Prouty goes on to say, only 3 small jets parked on an airfield near Santiago stood between success and failure. General C.P. Cabell, C-A-B-E-L-L, Dulles' CIA deputy who was running the operation in Dulles' absence, knew that as he monitored events at the command center in Washington. The engines on those 4 bombers at Puerto Cabezas idled slowly as the minutes grew to hours. If they were to strike at dawn, they had to leave as scheduled. It was a long way to Santiago across the Caribbean. The CIA operations control officer got on his bicycle again and pedaled back to the communications tent to see if the orders releasing the planes had come. The Cubans in the B-26s were angry and impatient. The thought crossed the agent's mind they might mutiny and go anyhow. The CIA agent wished they would go, but there were no orders from Washington. The CIA mission commander was an old friend of mine. We had been through many clandestine operations together, and we had complete confidence in each other. At about 2 a.m. Washington time on April 17th, my home telephone rang. The mission commander was calling from Nicaragua. He explained what was happening. He held the phone up, and I could hear the roaring B-26 engines. He emphasized the crucial timing for that essential flight. They had to go. He asked me to call the CIA command center and to talk to them about getting the release out immediately. The fate of the operation hung on that thin thread, and the thread broke. Well, Prouty next goes on to describe a number of bogus versions of the history of the Bay of Pigs, all of which, as I said, followed the sort of traditional line that Kennedy was responsible for the failure, for the operation's failure, because he neglected or deliberately withheld air cover. And of course, as we have seen and will delve into in greater detail, that failure was due to C.P. Cabell's failure to send off the airstrike to neutralize Castro's T-33s. Anyway, Prouty goes on to describe the bogus versions of the Bay of Pigs and what really happened as follows. There have been many versions of the Bay of Pigs. All have been written by people who were not involved. Robert D. Morrow, M-O-R-R-O-W, wrote a fantastic account in a book called Betrayal. His account is incorrect. Reporters have written about the Bay of Pigs, but they reported only what they could find out from others. They were not involved. They knew only what they were told. The most contrived account is contained in John Ehrlichman's recent novel, The Company. He has his JFK, unquote, president deciding to ensure the failure of the operation while at the same time not calling it off. There are other accounts of this crucial event. One of these, which appears to be authentic because of the inner sanctum role of the author, is Arthur Schlesinger's 1,000 Days. Schlesinger recalls, at 4:30 a.m. invasion morning, Cabell awoke Rusk, and later appealed to President Kennedy to permit the vital B-26 mission to go. There is no evidence Cabell called JFK even then, nor was there any reason to call at that time. This was a clever ruse. Prouty goes on to say here, this was a clever ruse. Remember, I was called at about 2 a.m. At 2 a.m. or even 3 a.m., there was still time for the B-26s to fly from Nicaragua to Santiago and hit their targets by daybreak. By 4:30 a.m., it was much too late. To be effective, the B-26s had to hit those T-33s on the ground no later than daybreak. I would interrupt here, but you will recall it would have taken a long time for the B-26s to fly across the Caribbean to Santiago, Cuba. Continuing here, as Prouty writes, to be effective, the B-26s had to hit those T-33s on the ground no later than daybreak. This was crucial. The brigade was set to hit the beach at dawn. They knew that even before they hit the beach, they could be discovered. They were. At dawn, the alarm was flashed across Cuba, and the T-33s went into action. When Cabell withheld the release orders from his mission commander in Nicaragua, he doomed the whole operation to failure. This means that a purported 4:30 a.m. call from Cabell to Rusk, unquote, as reported by Schlesinger, was meaningless except in the event Cabell wanted Rusk, Bundy, and Schlesinger to believe he was trying to carry out the operation instead of thwarting it. Schlesinger's account proves this. He says, Castro's Air Force, alerted by the first clash, reacted with vigor. Unquote. The only combat Air Force Castro had that morning were those 3 T-33s. Then Schlesinger adds, Castro's forgotten, my emphasis, T-33s shot 4 B-26s down. Schlesinger's use of the word forgotten is strange. What in hell does he think all of us were doing that long night? Those T-33s were on everyone's mind. Cabell didn't forget them. We all screamed to him for action against them. He simply let the moment pass, and the whole operation went down the drain. None of us have forgotten that. After the call I received from Nicaragua, I spoke to the CIA command center. I told them about my call. I emphasized the urgency of action as planned. I was not on the CIA line of command and could do no more than pass on the word from Nicaragua. I had worked with most of those clandestine operators since 1955 and knew them well. I knew how dedicated they were and that they, too, wanted the release from Cabell. They believed he must have had some political or other important reason for holding back, but they assured me they would do everything possible to expedite the orders to the commander at Puerto Cabezas. The release never came. We'll never know exactly why. Cabell was a lifelong military officer with a splendid record. Cabell obeyed orders, but in this case, whose orders? He belonged to the ultra-Cold War sect, and he was more a Nixon enthusiast than a Kennedy man. Not much later, JFK fired Cabell. Kennedy may have learned what he needed to know. If you don't agree with this account, then consider what followed. The other air crews thought the Puerto Cabezas bombers had carried out their orders, so they went ahead with their part of the tactical plan. They flew to the beach and began to provide air support. At least 16 of these planes were shot down by the T-33 jets, and at least 32 crewmen died, many of them Americans. That morning, those 3 T-33s sank both invasion supply ships. That ended the nearby offshore supply support. During the next 2 days, those jets raked the beach and covered Castro's troops as they advanced on the brigade which had dug in just above the high tide line. The invasion failed totally. President Kennedy accepted the blame and later fired Allen Dulles. Prouty goes on to describe how Kennedy put together a team of his most trusted advisors in order to look into the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation, and that basically, following that, as mentioned above, he fired Allen Dulles, but that basically he then went on to attempt to bring covert operations from the control of the CIA back under his own control and that of the Pentagon. Prouty describes that, saying, "Each evening, Bobby would meet with Jack Kennedy and the Irish Inner Circle, O'Donnell, Sorensen, O'Brien, and others. Each evening they would go over every word spoken in the inquiry," that is, the inquiry into the Bay of Pigs. They looked for clues to the CIA's behavior. They tried to answer the questions, why had the CIA destroyed its own operation? What did the CIA gain in the defeat of the Cubans and in the degradation of the Kennedy administration? Day after day, the lesson became clear. The CIA had signaled Kennedy that his political fate was under CIA control, just as was Eisenhower's in the U-2 incident. Why didn't Cabell call Allen Dulles? There's no evidence that he ever did, and I recall in the anger and disappointment of the CIA operators after the disaster that I never heard anyone bring Dulles' name into the picture. Until some other explanation is found, there is no way to exonerate Cabell. As I mentioned a minute ago, Kennedy went on to clarify the CIA's role vis-a-vis covert operations and to emphasize that he wanted the final word, so to speak, for covert operations to be under his control with direct advice from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Prouty describes this, saying, "The committee learned all of this and more. It met daily well into May of 1961, and then it issued no written report. No report was necessary. JFK found out all he needed to know. Early in June of 1961, he signed some very important presidential directives known as National Security Action Memoranda 55, 56, and 57. These papers are the basis of the story told by Senator Mansfield, among others, that JFK said he would tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces. NSAM 55 was a most unusual directive. It was directed specifically to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman L. Lemnitzer, and it was signed personally by Kennedy. Ordinarily, the president would address the chairman directly only in time of actual war. Kennedy viewed that paper as a declaration that, quote, peacetime operations, unquote, a euphemism for clandestine activities in time of peace, were as important to him as actual wartime operations, and that he wanted the chairman to be his advisor in such instances. Kennedy planned to establish control over the CIA during the remainder of his first term in office. He confided to many that he would complete that Herculean task during his second term. He never achieved that. He was not able to restrain the growth of the war in Vietnam. He was not able to keep the lid on the growth of the CIA-inspired special forces. He was not alive by the end of his first term in office. It's interesting to note that the Church Committee, the Senate committee created to investigate the CIA, has published in Volume 4 of its findings what purports to be a history of the CIA. This official, unquote, history unaccountably misquotes the law which created the agency and misstates the duties and responsibilities of the CIA. Then it proceeds to list chronologically all of the National Security Council top-level directives which outline the CIA's role in covert activities. Although the chronology is almost complete, this important historical document ignores and omits Kennedy's directives NSAM 55, 56, and 57. Such a glaring oversight does more to highlight the behind-the-scenes power and adroitness of the CIA than anything else. This is what presidents have had to fight. It is what President Carter is tangled up in today.
Right, that was the section from Hard Rain, and once again, Dave was reading from an article by L. Fletcher Prouty, who was Air Force focal point officer, specifically involved in the Bay of Pigs, as the focal point officer between the Air Force and any need the CIA might have had for Air Force and military air cover or air support or any military air participation in any CIA operation. So a man in the know and a man in the middle of the Bay of Pigs. What some people think, myself included, was probably the watershed moment for relations between then newly elected President John F. Kennedy and the CIA.
Recall, very briefly, summing up what we looked at. First of all, Kennedy as a candidate had already penetrated this insider's cabal, which, against President Eisenhower's wishes and without his knowledge, was going ahead and planning this operation against Cuba. We then saw how the operation was undertaken, and the proposed airstrike to neutralize Castro's Air Force, the go order, so to speak, for that strike was withheld by General Charles P. Cabell. And we saw how this was responsible for the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation, that Kennedy had gone along with what he was supposed to do. In other words, apparently, according to Prouty's account, and bear in mind that Prouty was in the chain of communication, he was a liaison officer and a key one between the Pentagon and CIA, that apparently Kennedy fulfilled his part, his intended role in the mission, that it was General Charles P. Cabell who deep-sixed the Bay of Pigs operation, and as he indicated that later, even the Church Committee was influenced by the CIA to misrepresent not only Kennedy's actions vis-a-vis CIA and covert operations, but the very role of the CIA itself.
Okay, let's go back and look at a couple of other points, too, that are very important here. Now, again, Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher Prouty is making the point that, as the operation stood, President Kennedy had no role in the assignation of any part to the Air Force or the air support and air cover of the operation, and there was, in fact, nothing that he was supposed to have done. Now, what people have since claimed, especially CIA insiders, have tried to paint the picture that then they turned to John F. Kennedy and asked for air cover, and basically at that point, if John F. Kennedy had provided air cover once that the T-33s had been allowed to get off the ground, he would have in fact been declaring overt war on Cuba and would have in fact been putting U.S. planes instead of planes that could have been passed off as belonging to Cuban anti-Castro activists. He would have been putting U.S. planes into action against Cuban planes, which is an overt act of war, would have in fact have dragged the entire country into a war with Cuba, as opposed to the deniability. And now we're not talking about morality, we're talking about the facts of the occasion, as opposed to the deniability of the Bay of Pigs. Also, another key point that has to be reiterated, which is, according to all the reliable sources that we have found, most notably Colonel Prouty, who was in on it from the beginning, the entire Bay of Pigs operation was fostered and was nurtured long before John F. Kennedy was even elected. It was spearheaded by Richard Nixon, Allen Dulles, and the rest of the people that Prouty calls the secret team. And then when Kennedy came into office, and mind you, he only came into office in January of 1961, walked into the door of the White House on January 23rd, 1961, he was presented with a fait accompli, which means an accomplished fact, an accomplished thing. And so that's a crucial thing to keep in mind. Now, we are going to talk briefly about Mr. Cabell, or General Cabell again.
Okay, now keep in mind, before the Nipper presents you with the information about Cabell here, that at the time that Kennedy assumed the presidency, either the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus, the entire national security apparatus, or a majority interest thereof, had in essence declared its independence of the U.S. Constitution. It had begun to operate on its own, independent of and contradicting at times presidential authority, and that Kennedy, with those National Security Action Memoranda 55, 6, and 7, was attempting to bring covert operations back to some semblance of constitutionality, namely to reinstitute the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces as the ultimate arbiter of whether or not a covert operation was to be undertaken or not.
Okay, we're going to be reading now, I'm going to be reading now from a book entitled Coincidence or Conspiracy. It's been produced by the Committee to Investigate Assassinations under the direction of Bernard Fensterwald, Jr., and also compiled by Michael Ewing. This book is a Zebra Books product published by Kensington Publishing Corporation, New York, 1977, and it's copyrighted by the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. And Mr. Fez Fensterwald has a long history of research into the John F. Kennedy assassination and other political events.
Mr. Fensterwald, in addition to having been one of the long-standing assassination investigators, was none other than James McCord's defense attorney. James McCord was the security coordinator for the Committee to Re-elect the President for President Nixon in 1972. And James McCord led the so-called plumbers unit that was arrested inside of the Democratic National headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. The whole Watergate-JFK connection we're going to come back to in the future, but it's worth noting just where Fensterwald fits into American political life.
Right, and you can, his data, incidentally, that we're going to be citing here is the references have been checked and found quite solid. As to Mr. Fensterwald's position, it is kind of a strange one, and he certainly, if nothing else, has been a Washington insider, as evidenced by his representation of Mr. McCord, and we'll be talking about that in the past. But once again, this documentation has been found other places. We're just choosing this because this is a well-ordered source for what we're talking about. Once again, reading from Coincidence or Conspiracy, produced by the Committee to Investigate Assassination.
Now, keep in mind here that the subject of the discussion here, General Charles T. Cabell, is the individual that Prouty has fingered as withholding the go order for the B-26 strike to neutralize Castro's Air Force, thereby sabotaging the entire CIA's Bay of Pigs operation, usually attributed to the failure of which is attributed to Kennedy.
That's right. Okay. And under the subheading of General Charles T. Cabell, I read as follows. Air Force General Charles Cabell served as Deputy Director of the CIA under Allen Dulles, and as acting director of the CIA during the Bay of Pigs invasion while Dulles was out of the country. According to the Senate Intelligence Committee report in late 1975, as deputy director of the CIA, General Cabell had also been a party to the secret CIA mafia assassination conspiracies against Fidel Castro during the latter part of September of 1960. According to a secret CIA Inspector General's report, noted by the Senate Intelligence Committee, quote, with Bissell present, Edwards briefed the director, Allen Dulles, and the DDCI, that's the deputy director, Cabell, General Charles T. Cabell, on the existence of an assassination plan involving members of the syndicate. And they're referring to an assassination plan against Fidel Castro. Days later, during the week of September 25th, Robert Mayhew, that's spelled M-A-H-E-U, that's a name that crops up quite often in this type of work, the CIA support chief, and mafia leaders John Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Traficante met in Miami to set up the secret assassination plans, according to the Senate committee. Again, at this point, they're talking about the assassination of Fidel Castro. General Cabell was later replaced as deputy director of the CIA by President Kennedy in April 1962, due to what Kennedy believed was Cabell's poor performance during the Bay of Pigs invasion and planning. While Kennedy had been greatly angered over what he believed was the astonishingly negligent invasion planning, he had rejected the advice of some aides to dismiss the CIA and military officials on whom he placed the blame. Pierre Salinger recalled the president remarking, quote, we really blew this one. How could that crowd at CIA and the Pentagon be this wrong? Still, as Salinger recalls, Kennedy decided to wait a, quote, decent interval before replacing the top CIA officials. JFK's former press secretary remembers the president stating, quote, if I'm going to knock some heads together, now isn't the time to do it with everybody looking down the barrel at us. While Deputy CIA Director Cabell's role in the secret CIA mafia assassination conspiracies was revealed in late 1975, the general had been the subject of an even more startling allegation about assassinations 2 years earlier. On September 16, 1973, the Washington Post reported, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, as late as March 1971, was preparing to accuse another person of conspiring to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. Garrison's intended defendant this time was the late Air Force General Charles Cabell, former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Post reported that only limited details were available about the controversial district attorney's latest conspiracy theory, but noted that General Cabell's brother, Earl Cabell, had been mayor of Dallas at the time of the assassination. The Post reported that Earl Cabell was aware of Garrison's suspicions that he or his brother may have been involved in the assassination, and had said of Garrison, quote, "He's nuttier than a fruitcake." The Washington Post account also stated that Garrison had told a former aide about his suspicions of what he claimed were General Cabell's, quote, "mysterious movements in New Orleans" in November of 1963. Garrison reportedly believed that President Kennedy's decision to remove Cabell as deputy director of the CIA, and replace other CIA officials as well, had played a part in what Garrison claimed was the eventual assassination conspiracy. As far as is known, however, Garrison never pursued these allegations any further. General Charles Cabell died of a heart ailment on May 25, 1971, in a Fort Myers clinic. During his retirement, Cabell served as consultant to Howard Hughes in the Hughes Aircraft Corporation and as a board member of Air America, a CIA proprietary firm. Cabell reportedly worked closely with Robert Mayhew during that period. All right, so once again, just to quickly reiterate the connections there, General Charles T. Cabell, who Fletcher Prouty, a man in a position to have deep inside information on the subject, has fingered, as Dave put it, as the person who scotched the Bay of Pigs operation, who chose not to send in the air support, or the air cover rather, to destroy Castro's T-33 planes on the ground, thereby destroying the entire invasion and any chance it might have of success, and putting the blame for it squarely in the lap of the president. General Charles T. Cabell, coincidentally enough, turns out that his brother was the mayor of Dallas, who apparently also, Dave, had helped to arrange the route of the motorcade.
He did, and he was in the motorcade himself, as of course was then Texas Governor John Connally, who, as Secretary of the Navy, basically sort of ex post facto downgraded Lee Harvey Oswald's discharge to dishonorable. Remember, he had initially had an honorable discharge after allegedly defecting to the Soviet Union and performing espionage against the United States. Then Secretary of the Navy John Connally, who was governor of Texas, also in the motorcade, and along with Earl Cabell, Dallas mayor, helped arrange the motorcade route. He downgraded Oswald's status to dishonorable, and John Connally later, of course, became Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury.
And, of course, John Connally is going to play a rather key role in some of the discussions that we're going to be having next week when we talk about the magic bullet and the single bullet theory and the assassination of John F. Kennedy, because, of course, John Connally found himself perhaps rather closer to the events than he might have wished to be, and, in fact, closer than anybody might have wished to be.
And it's worth noting here that this coincidence that Cabell, Charles T. Cabell, who Prouty attributes the failure of the Bay of Pigs to, his brother just happened to be the mayor of Dallas and arranging the motorcade route. As we're going to see, there is a remarkable series of coincidences. Indeed, as the title of Fensterwald book implies, is it a coincidence or is it a conspiracy? Can you have such a remarkable series of coincidences and still say with a straight face that they are coincidences? Now, a couple of interesting details that were brought up by Fensterwald in his account of Charles T. Cabell. Perhaps the most significant of those for our purposes right now is the fact that Cabell, as deputy director of the CIA, was one of the individuals involved with recruiting three top mafiosi, Sam Momo Giancana, John Rosselli, and Santos Trafficante, for attempts against the life of Fidel Castro. Now, Bay of Pigs, recall, has failed, and so now CIA is allegedly trying to get Castro out some other way. Now, recall that it was the CIA or an element thereof that prevented Bay of Pigs from getting rid of Castro, as we've seen. So certainly we have to, I think, at least ask ourselves, what was CIA's motivation in this whole thing? Now, in order to get rid of Castro, the CIA, through Sheffield Edwards and Richard Helms and Charles Cabell, turned to these three top mafiosi to get rid of Castro. Now, it's worth noting that the exact role of Charles Cabell in this CIA mafia plot to kill Castro is very mysterious, because the account of this event was drawn up by Richard Helms in 1967 for President Johnson. He made no mention of exactly what Cabell's role was. Cabell briefed Sheffield Edwards and Richard Helms, who were in charge of I've forgotten what their exact... I know Sheffield Edwards was in charge of operations, and I've forgotten exactly what Helms' title was, but they were the two CIA officials who Cabell briefed on what was going on. And Cabell's role remains very mysterious, and this is worth noting because he crops up as an increasingly mysterious and yet central, pivotal figure in this series of events.
carefully. It's important also to understand that the CIA did not suddenly turn to the Mafia with lily-white hands and say, maybe we could try these guys. There's a CIA-Mafia connection that goes back quite a long ways. At the end of the Second World War, the CIA was already pumping money in. I see you waving your finger there.
Yeah, I think in order to really understand the cooperation between U.S. intelligence and the Mafia before the key events after the war, which are really touched directly on what we're going to talk about, it might be worth noting that actually during World War II is where we have the beginning of the pattern of cooperation
with
between
FDR and Lucky Luciano.
What really happened was there was massive Axis sabotage on the docks of New York. To counter this, President Roosevelt turned to Lucky Luciano, who was, I believe at that time, capo mafioso for at least New York City, if not the whole syndicate. And, well, actually, he turned to Meyer Lansky. Luciano was in jail.
Right.
And Meyer Lansky set up a quid pro quo. He offered to enlist the entire syndicate army in order to prevent Axis sabotage on East Coast docks in return for Lucky Luciano's eventual release from prison. And so, as a result, the docks were secured. This pattern, this project was known as Operation Underworld, and it forged an effective pattern of cooperation between the mob and U.S. intelligence, and Lucky Luciano was eventually released from prison, and the mob secured the docks against Axis sabotage.
That's right, and the important thing, too, then, as this continues on, once the contact had been made, and we're going to be talking about this in a number of areas, how once an intelligence group makes a contact and begins to compromise itself for whatever purpose it feels is useful or worthwhile, it becomes very difficult to back out of these partnerships. We're going to be talking about that at some point as far as the United States intelligence network's contact with the Nazi intelligence network, and in fact this also became the case with the Mafia as more and more people in the right-wing intelligence apparat began to see the Mafia as being a tool against leftist activity in Italy, in newly freed Italy immediately at the end of World War II, and began to pump money into the Mafia there so that they could literally combat the Italian socialist and communist movements. They also did this in France and with the Corsican gangsters and a variety of other places. So by the time of the Bay of Pigs and the subsequent contacts between the CIA and the Mafia, the CIA had contacts with the Mafia for so long that there was no possibility of backing out, and one almost gets the feeling that they said to each other, well, as long as we're stuck in this together, why don't we enjoy it? And this pretty much brings us up to the point of the attempted assassinations of Fidel Castro.
Okay, now, it's worth noting that the mob didn't need a whole lot of prodding in order to be disposed to killing Fidel Castro. Now, the Mafia had a tremendous interest in Cuba. Meyer Lansky, the aforementioned, well, really the man who formed the syndicate, he's sort of credited with bringing organized crime up to the corporate level. So, Meyer Lansky had initially formed a working relationship with the deposed dictator, the dictator of Cuba that Castro deposed, Fulgencio Batista. Basically, during Prohibition, Lansky went to Cuba and basically worked out Cuba as a source of sugar cane, which, of course, is used for distilling whiskey. And it not only became, Cuba, that is, not only became a key source of sugar cane for the mob distillers and bootleggers, but it also became a tremendous source of narcotics after the re-legalization of the repeal of Prohibition and the legalization of liquor. So Cuba was a prime Mafia property. It was one of the main jumping-off points for the massive narcotics traffic into the United States that, in turn, was set up as a sort of a reward to the mob for their anti-communist efforts at the end of World War II. Their narcotics traffic was protected. It was guaranteed. Cuba was a key jumping-off point for that. Plus, Cuba was a very, very lucrative gambling center for the mob. The Cuban gambling casinos are sort of legend to this day. And so Cuba was a prime piece of Mafia property. They were extremely upset when Castro appropriated it and kicked the Mafia out.
Let me just also throw in that in the 1950s, early 1950s and mid-1950s, some of Richard Nixon's first contacts with organized crime took place in the Havana casinos, where he was taken down oftentimes actually as a guest of various what one could call shady elements. And of course, Richard Nixon, despite the fact that he was holding no public office after the point where John F. Kennedy took office, plays a very key role in a number of situations here, and in other places is at best in what would be called, if it's a conspiracy coincidence, a very suspicious coincidence. So once again, as we probably will not necessarily have time to detail in the information section of the show, but we may respond to questions during the phone-in sections, Richard Nixon's ties also to organized crime began at the same time that much of this network of the CIA and organized crime was being set up, specifically in Cuba.
Yeah, indeed. At the same post-World War II period, Nixon usually attributes, biographers of Nixon have attributed his political rise to an initiative undertaken by a mob attorney named Murray Chotiner. We're going to come back to Chotiner in the future. I don't want to devote too much time to him now. Now, it's worth noting, of course, as we just mentioned, that the Mafia hated Fidel Castro. They wanted Cuba back, so they didn't need any prodding on the part of CIA to go and kill Fidel Castro. So now, Charles T. Cabell, the fellow we talked about as being the primary suspect in the deep sixing of the Bay of Pigs operation, his brother is mayor of Dallas and arranges JFK's fatal motorcade. Earl Cabell was one of the primary CIA officials in charge with recruiting 3 top mafiosi to
Charles Cabell.
I confused me.
Just wanted
Okay.
to make that clear.
Charles Cabell. Earl Cabell is the brother and mayor of Dallas. Charles Cabell is the general. So in case I make that confusion again. Okay. Now, Charles Cabell, along with Sheffield Edwards and Richard Helms, 2 other key CIA officials, Helms became director eventually, go on and recruit. Again, the 3 mafiosis' names were Sam Giancana, usually known as Momo, who was capo mafioso for Chicago, John Rosselli, who was a former primary member of the Capone mob in Chicago, along with Jack Ruby, by the way. Ruby, and we're going to talk about his organized crime connections. Ruby began an organized crime as a group of teenage couriers for the Capone mob, working with Frank the Enforcer Nitty, who some of you may have seen a characterization of on the Untouchables TV show that still runs on a lot of VHF stations. Now, basically, the 3 mafiosi did not obviously kill Fidel Castro. What's worth noting here is that according to John Rosselli, and this information first surfaced in a Jack Anderson column, according to John Rosselli, some of the people recruited to kill Fidel Castro went on to kill John Kennedy. And this is, obviously, this brings us to the assassination of Kennedy, and it's worth noting here as well that the Mafia hated John F. Kennedy at least as much as they hated Fidel Castro.
And a crucial point to be made here, however, is that, and this is something that has come up quite a bit lately in assassination research or people wanting answers to the actual thing of if there was a conspiracy, then who did it? Well, one of the latest series of stories that has been floated is that the Mafia was in fact wholly and totally responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, just to quickly address this point, and we'll address it in greater length later on, a very important thing that any kind of intelligence apparatus operation, an important thing to be aware of is what the CIA calls modified limited hangout. Now, the CIA, anytime they engage in an operation, has a series of cover stories, a series of stratified cover stories, very much like, let's say, the rings on an onion, okay, the different skins of an onion. And some of the top ones are meant to be flimsy. They're meant to sow misinformation and to get people nervous and get people to start to doubt anything because there's so many stories being floated around. Once these stories are peeled through, the CIA begins what's called the modified limited hangout. In other words, when somebody starts to close in on a CIA operation, and this is not something I'm making up, by the way, nip tuck inserts parenthetically. This is something that the CIA has basically come out in CIA documents. It's come out from people who've been in the CIA and have later gone on to talk about their experiences. The CIA then goes into the modified limited hangout mode. That's their slang for it. And what that means is that they will admit to something that is a very minor consequence, but that they have already been pinned to, and they'll say, oh, you clever researchers, you caught us, you found out the whole truth, that's it. Boy, you know, you're right, we did hire the Mafia to try and kill Fidel Castro. The CIA then can feel that they have backed out without compromising any of their real secrets, or any other intelligence group can. I mean, it's not just the CIA, but they can feel that they have not compromised their real secrets while throwing a bone to the people who are investigating, who can then feel that they have solved the mystery. Now, I personally feel, and I think we'll prove this as we go along in the series, that this is, in fact, what the Mafia story is. And as an illustration, before getting back to Dave, who's going to do some reading on the subject, an important thing to think about is the fact that it's a common thing, and a common thing known to any law enforcement officer. And I think that if any of you folks know a policeman who's worked in the big city, in any big city in which there is a syndicate or organized crime involvement, that officer will tell you that the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, the whatever you want to call it, the syndicate organized crime, does not kill police officers if in any possible way avoidable. because of the fact that the things that come back on the mafia because of the killing of one of the upholders of society's virtues, if you'll have it, is so much worse than anything that the mafia can benefit. In other words, in some ways, the mafia will be allowed to slide and will be allowed to handle certain types of things, their drugs, their gambling, their vices, and the police will turn a deaf ear and a blind eye. But once a police officer has been killed, the police will descend with vengeance. And this is why the mafia kills other mafiosi, but does not kill police officers. And if you want to extrapolate out to the Kennedy assassination, it's pretty obvious that the mafia as a group would not have been responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy if they could possibly, unless they had some kind of word from the inside.
Okay, now, and we're going to come back to the whole subject of could the mafia have done it in weeks to come. Now, it's important to note here that the mafia hated Kennedy and had many reasons to have wanted to kill him. And keep in mind, as we just seen, that the mafia is, in a certain sense, inseparable from the U.S. intelligence apparatus. They're part of it. They've been working in conjunction with it, so really it is sort of, in a sense, academic as to where the mob leaves off and the CIA begins. Now, these three mafiosi, Giancana, Roselli and Santos Trafficante were recruited by CIA to kill Castro, which they did not do. And as I mentioned, according to John Roselli, some of the people recruited by, some of the mobsters recruited by CIA to kill Castro wound up killing Kennedy. Now, at this point, let's take a look at some of the reasons why the mob hated John Kennedy. First of all, they blamed John Kennedy for the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation, and as such, were looking to avenge themselves on him in some fashion or another for having failed to regain their Cuban sanctuary for them. A second reason is that basically the Kennedy brothers had been extremely active against the mafia even before John became president and his brother Robert became Attorney General. The Kennedys were both very active, Robert in particular, with the Senate's McClellan Committee, which investigated organized crime and the mafia relationship with the Teamsters Union and James Hoffa in particular. Now, when the Kennedys came into office, that is, John became president and Robert Attorney General, they undertook a huge, literally a war against the mafia and directed the entire federal law enforcement establishment against the mob and were doing more against organized crime than anyone had done in a long, long time. And it is worth noting that there were numerous attempts to, or numerous accounts of the mafia threatening John F. Kennedy's life, and that's what we're going to turn to right now. I'm going to be reading to you from a book called The Hoffa Wars. It's an excellent book authored by a man named Dan Moldea, last name Moldea. It was published in softcover by Charter Books, and it was copyrighted in 1978. And in this particular passage here, we're going to see, that I'm about to read you from Moldea's book, we're going to see threats against the life of Kennedy by two key mafiosi. One of these was Santos Trafficante, who is generally believed to be capo mafioso for Florida and in charge of the entire Cuban mafia connection. And he was one of the fellows who we're going to see uttering a threat against Kennedy's life in the same month as another key mafioso, a man named Carlos Marcello, last name Marcello. Trafficante, by the way, is Trafficante. Now, Carlos Marcello was capo mafioso, head mafioso for New Orleans, and he was named by the House Select Committee to investigate assassinations as a probable conspirator in the assassination of Kennedy, interrupting the House Select Committee on Investigation. The House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that there had been a conspiracy to kill both John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and they named Carlos Marcello as a probable conspirator in the JFK case. Now, keep Carlos Marcello's name in mind here as you listen to this, and keep Santos Trafficante, who along with John Roselli and Sam Giancana were recruited by Cabell and the rest of the CIA to kill Castro, and according to Roselli, they wound up killing Kennedy. Now, reading once again from The Hoffa Wars by Dan E. Moldea. That month, as word of Valachi's cooperation leaked out, that, by the way, refers to Joe Valachi, a turncoat mafioso who spilled a lot of key information to the Congress about the mob. Beginning again. That month, as word of Valachi's cooperation leaked out, Carlos Marcello met with his top henchman in a cottage near New Orleans. During the meeting, Marcello, according to a report, was in a frenzy about Robert Kennedy and especially Marcello's own recent kidnapping, which had been engineered by the Attorney General near the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Both Marcello and Russell Bufalino had gotten deportation orders, and were battling the government with the same attorney. Russell Bufalino was an organized crime figure as well and a close associate of Jimmy Hoffa. In the Marcello kidnapping, federal agents sent by the Attorney General arrested and handcuffed Marcello as he was walking down a New Orleans street. They drove him to a nearby airport, loaded him onto a private plane, and flew him out of the country. Since he carried a Guatemalan birth certificate, it was assumed that he was a native. After 2 months in Latin America, Marcello illegally flew back into the United States on his private plane, piloted by David Ferrie, last name F-E-R-R-I-E, an anti-Castro activist. Interrupting here, keep in mind the name David Ferrie. We're going to come back to him. I'm not going to interrupt here anymore to explain who he was. Remember the name. Back in America, Marcello began his successful appeal to fight permanent deportation, claiming that he had been sent away with no opportunity to call either his family or his lawyer. Marcello reportedly worked himself up over the incident and finally shouted an ancient Sicilian death threat against the Kennedy brothers. Levarsi na Petra de la Scarpa. Take the stone out of my shoe. He then announced that John Kennedy was going to be assassinated and that a nut, unquote, was going to be hired to handle the job. This recalled in 1962, a year before the assassination. That same month, Marcello's friend Trafficante, still involved in the CIA murder plots, was talking to Jose Aleman, last name A-L-E-M-A-N, a Cuban exile financier who was a respected FBI informant, about his hatred of the president. Have you seen how his brother is hitting Hoffa, a man who is a worker, who is not a millionaire, a friend of the blue collars? He doesn't know that this kind of encounter is very delicate. Mark my words, this man Kennedy is in trouble and he will get what is coming to him, unquote. Aleman, who was talking to the underworld leader about a $1.5 million Central States pension fund loan which Hoffa had personally cleared for Trafficante, responded that President Kennedy would probably be elected to a second term. No, Jose, Trafficante said firmly, he is going to be hit, unquote. When asked during the research of this book who was making the arrangements for the president's assassination, Aleman said that Trafficante had, quote, made it clear, unquote, that it was Hoffa. Okay, interrupting here very briefly, it's worth noting, I think, a little bit of postscript to this particular alleged assassination attempt against Castro and possible successful attempt on the life of Kennedy. Now, in 1975 and 6, the Senate Intelligence Committee undertook to investigate these CIA attempts against Castro, and specifically to investigate whether Rosselli's claim that this charge had backfired and resulted in the Kennedy assassination, whether there was any validity to this. Now, Sam Giancana was under FBI surveillance and police surveillance. He was to appear as a witness before the Senate Intelligence Committee. 2 weeks before he was to appear, he was murdered, found shot 6 times in the neck and face in his own home, supposedly while under FBI and Chicago police surveillance.
With friends like that, who needs enemies?
Well, now, not only that, but the Senate was less than thrilled by this. They asked the FBI to investigate Giancana's murder. The FBI, under then-Director Clarence Kelly, refused on the grounds of a technicality. Now, here's a Senate witness murdered, and the FBI refuses to investigate. Now, later, the following summer, John Rosselli in April testified secretly. Johnny Rosselli, the second of the triumvirate recruited by CIA to kill Castro. Johnny Rosselli testified in April in secret before the Senate Intelligence Committee. In August 10th specifically of 1976, Johnny Rosselli's decomposing and dismembered body was found floating in an oil drum in Biscayne Bay in Florida, which also is where Nixon called home, by the way. Now, interestingly enough, again, the Senate asked the FBI to investigate this murder. Again, the FBI refused to investigate the murder of a Senate witness. At this point, the Senate convened and began discussing this, and there was apparently, according to Bernard Fensterwald, in coincidence or conspiracy, in essence, the Senate staged a little session where they threatened to undertake an investigation of the FBI's role in looking into the JFK assassination, and at that point, the FBI agreed reluctantly to investigate the death of Johnny Rosselli. Now, Jimmy Hoffa, who was named by the recently deceased Jose Aleman, he died in a shootout with Miami police recently. Jimmy Hoffa, who supposedly was organizing, according to Jose Aleman, who was organizing the attempts on Kennedy's life by the mob, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared roughly a month after Sam Giancana was murdered in Chicago, and his body has never been found. And worth noting, too, that Jose Aleman's father was a Batista official left when Castro took over Cuba, and the Alamans have been very much involved and very lucratively involved in the powerful Cuban exile community in Florida. So an interesting postscript to what happened with these fellows who were involved. Santos Traficante, by the way, was served with a subpoena to testify in front of the committee. He was visibly shaken, according to the person who served him with the committee. His hands were, with the subpoena rather, his hands were trembling, and his face was white, and this from an individual who didn't blanch it very much. It took a lot to shake up Santos Traficante.
Amen.
Now, returning again to Santos Traficante, returning again to some possible mob connections to the assassination of President Kennedy, it's worth noting here, and bear in mind Hoffa's antipathy to the Kennedy brothers, it's worth noting that Jack Ruby, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald before he could come to trial and silenced him, Jack Ruby had numerous ties to organized crime and numerous ties to the Hoffa mob. Returning once again to the Hoffa Wars by Dan Molday. Interestingly enough, Jack Ruby, there is an indication that he may have met with Santos Traficante in Cuba on what looks to be a possible intelligence mission. And Molday writes in the Hoffa Wars as follows. Another possible piece of the Jack Ruby puzzle comes from a CIA memorandum of November 26, 1963, which reports that a British journalist, John Wilson, informed the American embassy in London that while in a Cuban prison in 1959, he met, quote, an American gangster named Ruby, unquote. Wilson, jailed by the Castro government and then deported to England, said that he had also become acquainted with, quote, an American gangster gambler named Santos, who could not return to the USA because there were several indictments outstanding against him. Instead, he preferred to live in relative luxury in a Cuban prison. It was Santos whom Ruby, quote, visited frequently, unquote. Wilson's Santos was a perfect description of Santos Traficante, who was indeed in a Cuban prison during mid-1959 and had criminal charges against him in the United States. Although Jack Ruby and Jimmy Hoffa shared some of the same friends, including Paul Dorfman and David Yaris, as well as associates of Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, and Santos Traficante, that alone does not represent a direct relationship between them. Recalling now that Ruby, as mentioned a couple of minutes ago, was a member basically of the Capone organized crime organization in Chicago from the time when he was a kid in a youth gang that basically ran messages and bottles of booze for the Capone mob. Now, some much more interesting connections here between Hoffa people and of course, Hoffa's involvement with organized crime was massive. Between Hoffa people and Ruby are delineated here by Molday. Now, what Molday is going to be talking about here are some interesting phone calls between Jack Ruby and two Hoffa organized crime associates named Barney Baker, who is basically Hoffa's chief strong-arm man, and a Hoffa attorney named Irwin S. Weiner, last name W-E-I-N-E-R, Weiner being basically, as I said, an organized crime attorney closely affiliated with Hoffa. And in the weeks immediately prior to the assassination of Kennedy, Jack Ruby called both of these men, and the interesting circumstances surrounding these calls is related by Molday as follows in the Hoffa Wars. Interestingly enough, however, on October 26, 1963, Ruby placed a long-distance call to Chicago to SH-3-6865. FBI records established that this 12-minute call went to Irwin S. Weiner, W-E-I-N-E-R, a veteran member of Hoffa's closest circle of underworld advisors and the major bondsman for the Teamsters Union. By the late 1950s, according to Walter Sheridan, quote, Weiner was representing himself as the exclusive agent for the Teamsters Union bonding, unquote. Speaking from his still thriving bonding business in Chicago, Weiner says that he and Ruby were personal friends. Ruby was a friend of mine. He called me. I talked to him. What I talked to him about was my own business, and I just don't feel that I should discuss it with anyone. It has no bearing on anything, unquote. Weiner adds that he had known the Ruby family since the early days on Chicago's West Side, when Ruby's brother Earl was one of his best friends. I was in fairly regular touch with Earl. He was one of my closest friends from back in school. Later, he moved to Detroit, where he opened up a laundry business, Cobo Cleaners, in about 1961. 4 days after the call to Weiner at 9:13 p.m. on October 30th, Ruby called CH25431 in New Orleans and spoke to Nofio Pecora, P-E-C-O-R-A, a key member of Carlos Marcello's tightly knit apparatus. Pecora's brother-in-law, Dalton Smith, was Marcello's closest underworld advisor and frontman. Smith, incidentally, Smith was, incidentally, associated with two other Dallas friends of Jack Ruby. Second, Pecora's sister-in-law was the wife of Joseph Poretti, who managed some of Marcello's real estate holdings, coordinating them with the mob boss's $500 million a year gambling network. And Pecora's wife, formerly in business for herself, was now Marcello's secretary. In an analysis of the Marcello empire, Aaron Cohn, K-O-H-N, a respected authority on organized crime, noted that, quote, Nofio Pecora is an ex-convict with extensive past history in the heroin trade. He and his wife directed a call girl ring between Louisiana and Mississippi. On November 7th at 2:12 p.m., Barney Baker, a former street brawler and prize fighter who was one of Hoffa's top aides before Robert Kennedy put him in jail, called Ruby from Chicago. There is no record of an initial call to Baker from Ruby, although Baker claims that he was simply returning a call from a Dallas nightclub owner whom he did not know. So, summing up again, interesting phone calls in the weeks prior to the assassination between Jack Ruby and Hoffa bondsman Irwin Weiner, Hoffa strong-arm enforcer Barney Baker, and key Carlos Marcello associate Nofio Pecora, and recall the threat against Kennedy's life made by Marcello that we discussed a minute ago.
All right, and the key point here with Jack Ruby is to remember that a little later on, most notably probably next week, when we're talking about the actual events of the assassination, you will know, and if you do not know already, that Jack Ruby managed to, as he claimed, coincidentally be just in the area where he happened to be able to find the 20 seconds when Lee Harvey Oswald was available to be shot, and did in fact shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, claiming that he had no other motive than to spare the president's widow from the suffering of having to come back to Dallas to testify. And then, of course, Jack Ruby later on came up with some rather interesting contradictory testimony that, in fact, he was not allowed to give outside of Dallas. And we'll talk about that at some length. So just remember Jack Ruby's very tight ties to organized crime and his suspiciously close ties immediately before, in terms of contact made immediately before the John F. Kennedy assassination.
Now, recall how when we dealt with the Francis Gary Powers book, Operation Overflight, Powers was the first of many to intimate that Lee Harvey Oswald was basically a Soviet sympathizer or agent who was responsible for downing the U-2 and consequently scotching the summit conference between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Now, Oswald did indeed emigrate to the Soviet Union. While in the Soviet Union, he got a job at a radio factory, was interviewed by a number of people in the U.S. Embassy, all of whom later turned out to be CIA officials, or agents, I should say. And then, despite the fact that he had supposedly committed treason against the United States and espionage by revealing top-secret information on North American air defenses as well as the U-2's radar situation, that he then encountered remarkably little difficulty in getting back into the United States. He did this, the action of getting Oswald back into the U.S. was initiated through a letter to Texas Senator John Tower, who became chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Oswald got back into the United States, was never indicted or prosecuted for his espionage, and was able to move about the United States rather freely. Now, one of the interesting things is that Lee Harvey Oswald began work on behalf of Fidel Castro, or at least allegedly so. He became not only the head of, but the sole member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, New Orleans chapter, and as it turned out, he was the only member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee New Orleans chapter, but he was not the only person who hung around their headquarters.
Let me stress also this point that Dave is making. Now, on one level, now remember out there, those of you who are not so familiar with some of the subject matter that we're talking about or with the dealings of intelligence, it is very important to remember that the key thing going on here is the difference between reality and appearance. And in this case, Lee Harvey Oswald, who defected to the Soviet Union claiming that he was going to give away all of America's top secret information on air defense and things of this nature, went to Russia, came back, and as a matter of fact, in the process of moving back, I believe he even received a $400 loan from somebody in the government through the State Department to enable him to finish up his affairs and to be able to get back to the United States. When he came into the country, he was never what's called a post-situational interview. He was never debriefed. Thank you very much. He was never debriefed. As a matter of fact, the only person out to meet this heinous defector who'd gone to the Soviet Union, our Cold War enemy, in pitched battle to give them all of our air secrets, the only man out to meet him was a gentleman by the name of Spaz T. Rakin, who was theoretically was a representative of Traveler's Aid, but was in fact a representative of several Eastern European, violently, almost fanatically anti-communist groups who came out in a very friendly manner to meet this Soviet defector, this pro-Castro, pro-Russian defector, instead of any kind of government official who might want to know what Lee Harvey Oswald had talked to the Soviets about while he was in Russia.
It's interesting, too, that Oswald, the supposed leftist, associated with an enormous number of right-wing people. Now, something we're going to talk about next week and in weeks to come concerns the fact that the address for Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee, recall he was its only member, opened on, it basically was in a building which had another entrance on a different street. One was 544 Camp Street and one was 541 Lafayette Place in New Orleans. I can never remember which was which was the headquarters of the so-called Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and which was an office of a former FBI agent and ultra-right-winger named Guy Bannister.
544 Camp Street was the address on Oswald's literature. And again, we're talking about appearance versus reality. Lee Harvey Oswald has had a series of handbills printed up that said the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, of which he was only the treasurer, supposedly, and it had an address of 544 Camp Street. In reality, he may have been the treasurer. He also would have had to have been the president, the vice president, all the members, because, as Dave said, he was the only member. And 542 Lafayette Street was the address kitty-cornered. In other words, it was a building on a corner. One corner was 544 Camp Street. The door on the other corner was 542 Lafayette Street. They both led up to a first-floor landing, and the office space shared on that first-floor landing with Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee was the offices of a detective who was a former CIA, FBI agent who had many contacts with the anti-Castro Cuban crowd and the Bay of Pigs crowd by the name of Guy Bannister.
None of that, but Guy Bannister was affiliated with Division 5 of the FBI, which is the Internal Security Division. Now, Oswald got in a very highly publicized street altercation with a guy named Carlos Bringuier, who is a Cuban exile affiliated with CIA, and this resulted eventually in an on-air interview between Oswald and a couple of individuals that Nip Tuck is going to tell you about. And this is interesting because this interview certainly laid the groundwork for representing Oswald as a communist sympathizer, if not indeed a Soviet agent, whereas the official version of the Warren Commission's thesis, the Warren Commission thesis was that Oswald was a lone nut. And when the facts of the situation are examined, Oswald's contacts appear to be overwhelmingly not only right, but far right. And it's worth noting here that there was a definite and apparently deliberate effort to represent Oswald as a leftist and to achieve a great deal of publicity with this effort.
Okay, I'm going to be reading from a book entitled Conspiracy. It's by Anthony Summers. It was published in 1980 by McGraw-Hill Books. As a matter of fact, got a lot of very good reviews when it came out. A very scholarly book on the subject of Lee Harvey Oswald and his intelligence contacts.
Summers is a BBC reporter who was commissioned by the BBC to undertake its investigation of the Kennedy assassination.
All right. Once again, reading from Conspiracy and talking first and foremost about a man named Carlos Bringuier, with whom Lee Harvey Oswald had a very publicized shoving match which enabled him to become known in media circles as a Marxist, because, of course, then he was dragged onto radio programs and interviewed by newspaper reporters, because somebody who was willing to go out in public and hand out handbills for Castro in those days was quite a bit more visible than they would be these days. So once again, that's the first person we're going to be talking about, is this anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Carlos Bringuier. And I read from Summers' book as follows. Carlos Bringuier, the exile in the New Orleans clash with Oswald, certainly had contact with the CIA. He was a New Orleans delegate of the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, the outgrowth of a militant Cuban student group. The group had naturally been deeply involved with the CIA at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and continued to receive funds afterward. The Assassinations Committee found that Bringuier had reported his contact with Oswald to his group's headquarters in Miami, and that the information had in turn been relayed to the CIA. A document obtained from the agency that's from the CIA itself, reveals that the CIA had, quote, past contact with Carlos Bringuier. Contact was limited to domestic service activities, unquote. As we noted in the case of George de Morenschild's CIA contacts, the Domestic Contacts Division is best known for its efforts to obtain information from travelers returning from communist countries. However, CIA spokesmen have in the past confused inquirers by using that title rather than, quote, Domestic Operations Division. The clandestine department, which by 1963 was conducting secret operations within the United States. Let me go back and just restate that real quickly. The agency's own memos revealed that they had had past contacts with Carlos Bringuier, which they claimed the contact was limited to domestic service activities. However, and I quote again from Summers, CIA spokesmen have in the past confused inquirers by using that title, namely Domestic Services, rather than Domestic Operations Division, the clandestine department which by 1963 was conducting secret operations within the United States. Carlos Bringuier, as New Orleans head of the DRE, also published a right-wing news sheet backed by the Crusade to Free Cuba Committee. The committee was funded by the CIA. It turns out that the agency's fingerprints mark every stage of the process by which Oswald was exposed as a communist. Very little about that, it seems, was spontaneous. First, Carlos Bringuier called William Stuckey, a young reporter who had a weekly radio program on station WDSU. Stuckey went to see Oswald and found him a clean-cut, articulate figure, quite the opposite of the unkempt, wild-looking left-wing prototype he had anticipated. After recording and broadcasting the initial interview, one which he would later recall as oddly, quote, deliberate, Stuckey then began planning a follow-up debate program. What ensued was a classic case of media manipulation for political profit. Stuckey found himself positively showered with information guaranteed to smear Oswald. First, there was a telephone conversation with either the head or the deputy head of the local FBI office, who obligingly read out aloud large extracts from Oswald's file. Thus did Stuckey learn of Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union. Soon the industrious Bringuier popped up again, eager to impress similar information on the reporter. He said he had obtained it by sending an anti-Castro colleague to see Oswald, posing as a Castro sympathizer. Finally, the same day, Stuckey received a phone call from Edward Butler, director of a right-wing propaganda information called the Information Council of the Americas, or INCA, I-N-C-A. Butler confided that after telephone calls to Washington, he had confirmed Oswald's Soviet connections with, quote, someone at the House Un-American Activities Committee. The very title, Council of the Information Council of the Americas, speaks volumes for its origins and allegiances. At the time of the Oswald revelations, its manager was a member of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the anti-Castro government in exile created by the CIA.
Okay, now we're in just a second going to play you the interview, a tape of the interview that was conducted by Jim Stuckey, Ed Butler, and Carlos Bringuier with Lee Harvey Oswald on WDSU. Now, before we get into the tape, two details that I'd like to call to your attention, two things to pay close attention to. First of all, in the very beginning of the interview, Lee Harvey Oswald was going to be asked a question about his status, about the status of his citizenship while in the Soviet Union, and his reply is very halting. He stutters, but he initially says that at all times while in the Soviet Union, he was under the protection of the United States government, and then he quickly he hems and haws and backtracks and negates that.
Now, again, just to clue you into this stuff, because it all goes by rather quickly, a very odd thing for somebody to say, or even to claim any kind of connection with the U.S. government for somebody who is supposedly and purportedly defected to the Soviet Union because of his disgust with the United States and with the avowed purpose of giving away America's military secrets.
Also, take note of the fact that Carlos Bringuier, right, the member of the DRE, the CIA-sponsored Cuban student group, that Carlos Bringuier asks a very provocative question to Lee Harvey Oswald. He mentions that Castro characterized President Kennedy as a ruffian and a thief, then asks Lee Harvey Oswald whether he agrees with Castro's characterization of Kennedy. This is worth noting because the tape of this interview that we're going to play was broadcast all over the United States the evening of the assassination. So basically what you're about to hear was heard by all of America on the evening that JFK was assassinated.
All right. So once again, this is William Stuckey's radio interview, and the participants are the people that we have outlined. Carlos Bringuier, an anti-Castro Cuban with CIA contacts; Ed Butler, a very prominent right-winger, later with contacts to the John Birch Society and other groups, also with CIA contacts; and Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of John F. Kennedy.
Stuckey and I are talking with three guests: Lee Harvey Oswald, who is local secretary of a group called Fair Play for Cuba, and with Ed Butler, the executive director of the Information Council of the Americas, and Carlos Bringuier, a Cuban refugee and obviously anti-Castro. Mr. Oswald, as you might imagine, is on the hot seat tonight, and I believe, Bill Stuckey, you have a question for him.
Yes, Mr. Oswald, I believe you said in reply to a question from Mr. Butler that any questions about your background were extraneous to the discussion tonight. I disagree because of the fact that you refuse to reveal any of the other members of your organization, so you are the face of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. Therefore, anybody who might be interested in this organization ought to know more about you. For this reason, I'm curious to know just how you supported yourself during the 3 years that you lived in the Soviet Union. Did you have a government subsidy?
Well, I will answer that question directly then, since you will not rest until you get your answer. I worked in Russia. I was under the protection of that is to say, I was not under the protection of the American government, but that is, I was at all times considered an American citizen. I did not lose my American citizenship.
Did you say you wanted to at one point, though, or what happened?
Well, it's a long, drawn-out situation in which permission to live in the Soviet Union granted to a foreign resident is very rarely given. This requires a certain amount of technicalities, technical papers, and so forth. At no time, as I say, did I renounce my citizenship or attempt to renounce my citizenship, and at no time was I out of contact or with the American Embassy.
Excuse me, may I interrupt just 1 second? Either one of these two statements is wrong. The Washington Evening Star of October 31st, 1959, page 1, reported that Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine of 4936 Collingwood Street, Fort Worth, Texas, had turned in his passport at the American Embassy in Moscow on that same date and had said that he had applied for Soviet citizenship. And this seems to me that you've renounced your American citizenship if you've turned in your passport.
Well, the very obvious answer to that is that I'm back in the United States. A person who renounces his citizenship becomes legally disqualified for returning to the United States.
Right, and Soviet authorities, this is from the Washington Post and Times Herald of November 16, 1959, Soviet authorities had refused to grant it, although they had informed him that he could live in Russia as a resident alien. What did you do during the 2 weeks from October 31st to November 16, 1959?
As I've already stated, of course, this whole conversation, and we don't have too much time left, is getting away from the Cuban-American problem. However, I'm quite willing to discuss myself for the remainder of this program. As I stated, it is very difficult for a resident, for a foreigner to get permission to reside in the Soviet Union. During those 2 weeks and during the date that you mentioned, I was, of course, with the knowledge of the American Embassy, getting this permission.
Were you having a building at 11 Kuznetskaya Street in Moscow?
Kuznetskaya?
Mm-hmm.
Kuznetskaya is the, well, that would be probably the foreign ministry, I assume. No, I was never in that place, although I know Moscow, having lived there.
Mr. Butler, let me interrupt, and I think Mr. Oswald is right. To this extent, we should get around to the organization which he is the head of here in New Orleans, Fair Play for Cuba.
Committee. Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
As a practical matter, Mr. Oswald, knowing, as I'm sure you do, the sentiment in America against Cuba, we, of course, severed diplomatic relations some time ago. I would say Castro is about as unpopular as anybody in the world in this country. As a practical matter, what do you hope to gain through your work? How do you hope to bring about what you call fair play for Cuba, knowing the sentiment?
The principles of the fair play for Cuba consist of restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba. That is one of our main points. We are for that. I disagree that this situation regarding American-Cuban relations is very unpopular. We are in a minority, surely. We are, however, not particularly interested in what Cuban exiles or rightist members of rightist organizations have to say. We are primarily interested in the attitude of the United States government toward Cuba. And in that way, we are striving to get the United States to adopt measures which would be more friendly toward the Cuban people and the new Cuban regime in that country. We are not at all communist controlled, regardless of the fact that I have the experience of living in Russia, regardless of the fact that we have been investigated, regardless of any of those facts. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee is an independent organization, not affiliated with any other organization. Our aims and our ideals are very clear and in the best keeping with American traditions of democracy.
Do you agree with Fidel Castro when in his last speech of July 26 of this year, he qualified President John Fitzgerald Kennedy of the United States as a ruffian and a thief? Do you agree with Mr. Castro?
I would not agree. I would not agree with that particular wording. However, I and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee does think that the United States government, through certain agencies, namely the State Department and the CIA, has made monumental mistakes in its relations with Cuba. Mistakes which are pushing Cuba into the sphere of activity of, let's say, a very dogmatic communist country as China is.
Mr. Oswald, would you agree that when Castro first took power, would you agree that the United States was very friendly with Castro, that the people of this country had nothing but admiration for him, that they were very glad to see Batista thrown out?
I would say that the activities of the United States government in regard to Batista were a manifestation of not so much support for Fidel Castro, but rather a withdrawal of support from Batista. In other words, we stopped armaments to Batista. What we should have done was to take those armaments and drop them into the Sierra Maestre, where Fidel Castro could have used them. As for public sentiment at that time, I think even at that time, even before the revolution, there were rumblings of official comment and so forth from government officials against Fidel Castro.
You've never been to Cuba, of course, but why are the people in Cuba starving today?
Well, in any country emerging from a semi-colonial state and embarking upon reforms which require a diversification of agriculture, you're going to have shortages. After all, 80% of imports into the United States from Cuba were two products, tobacco and sugar. Nowadays, while Cuba is reducing its product as far as sugarcane goes, it is striving to grow unlimited and unheard of for Cuba quantities of certain vegetables, sweet potatoes, lima beans, cotton, and so forth, so that they can become agriculturally independent.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt. Our time is almost up. We've had three guests tonight on Conversation Carte Blanche. Bill Stuckey and I have been talking with Lee Harvey Oswald, Secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Ed Butler, Executive Director of the Information Council of the Americas, and Carlos Brinier, a Cuban refugee. Thank you very much, and good evening.
All right, and that was the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald, as well as the others introduced, and some rather interesting things that we pointed out before, which we hope you got a chance to catch, and some rather interesting things set up for all time. And one, again, cannot help but notice the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, a communist, supposed communist with no organization whatsoever, managed to make his Marxist sympathies and his relationship to the Castro regime and the Russian government awfully well known for a man with a committee of one.
Keep in mind that this interview was in August of 1963, about 3 months before Kennedy was killed, and it was aired, as we said, the evening of the assassination. Everybody heard what you just heard, and, well, what conclusions do you think they were supposed to draw? Keep in mind, particularly the name Ed Butler, one of the triumvirate who were interviewing Lee Harvey Oswald, because in future broadcasts of the Guns of November and the succeeding three, we're going to come back to Ed Butler. He's a very important figure.
Okay, one of the other key things to remember, and we're going to get into some of these coincidences of timing even more, but just in passing, since Dave mentioned it, it should be important to note that by the time that Lee Harvey Oswald had only been even mentioned in the public airwaves as a possible assassin of John F. Kennedy at like 6 o'clock, I think, on the evening of the assassination, or somewhere about that time in the early evening, and yet within a matter of maybe an hour and a half, there were people broadcasting this tape in several different locations all over the country. It was an extremely rapid way for this particular tape of Lee Harvey Oswald, a very obscure person by anybody's rights, even if the fact that being a pro-communist was fairly individual in those days. I mean, a very obscure person on a very obscure radio station, yet heard all over the country within a matter of practically minutes of his being announced as being a possible assassin.
Yeah, it was, the wire services carried Oswald as a suspect by mid-afternoon, so it was a few hours, but still, it was a remarkable distribution, and certainly the comment by Carlos Bringuier there would be an interesting thing to hear the evening that Oswald had supposedly killed the president. Indeed.
Now, before we go to the telephones, let me just run back down a couple of other things real quickly, and I think Dave will want to pitch in here too. As far as what we've heard tonight and what we're leading you up to with next week's show before we go to the telephones, and what we've seen is not only a Central Intelligence Service basically almost completely devoid from the elected power structure, and especially from the president. We've noticed a Central Intelligence Service not only devoid and removed from the president, but in the case of John F. Kennedy, apparently actively opposed, to the point of deep-sixing their own operations. We have seen a CIA and Mafia connection so strong that the CIA was hiring the Mafia to kill America's enemies, and we have seen connections between those two so strong that one mafiosa claimed that the Mafia gangsters, the gangster bosses, were able to in fact kill John F. Kennedy. We've seen the bitter hostility aroused by the Bay of Pigs, an operation that whose failure has been laid at the feet of John F. Kennedy, although people in the midst of the controversy in a position to know have indeed claimed that the CIA deep-sixed it themselves. And lastly, we have seen Lee Harvey Oswald, an obscure Marine, defecting to the Soviet Union untouched, claiming to be about to spill the beans on America's military secrets, being allowed back into the country without so much as a second thought, settling down with a bunch of right-wing czarist, white Russian anti-communists, traveling around the country, painting himself as a Marxist with absolutely no backing in terms of anybody else in his group, managing to get on a radio station and be interviewed by, among other people, two other gentlemen of extreme right-wing nature with contacts to the CIA, where he can proclaim to the world that he is, in fact, a Marxist.
This an individual who had supposedly committed espionage against the United States and who, although it was not to become public later, was being, at least in some circles, blamed for the failure of the U-2 and the deep-sixing of the summit conference between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. And as we've seen also, very importantly, with that charge of Oswald's complicity in the U-2 disaster, we have Oswald being, in essence, blamed for something which he could not possibly have been responsible for. So, again, we see a pattern which is to emerge in much larger and more important fashion with the Kennedy assassination. Also, keep in mind that the person to whom Fletcher proudly attributes the Bay of Pigs failure, Charles Cabell, basically his brother was mayor of Dallas, and he was one of the fellows who recruited the mafiosi to kill Castro, and as we've seen, according to at least one of them, they wound up operating against Kennedy. And recall what happened when the Senate Select Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, began investigating this connection. Three of the principals were murdered, and the FBI refused to investigate those murders.
All right. Some of the antecedents historically for the Kennedy assassination: the Cold War, the position of the CIA, the Mafia, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to be detailing in the following 3 weeks in the information sections the actual assassination itself and its ramifications. We're just about to open the phones up. We still have one line left open at 415-941-2500. And before we go to those phones, Dave has a little something else he wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I just want to mention very briefly that...
something that we, in fact, did not have time because we want to get you folks on the air. As a matter of fact, we had it all set into the program, but as I mentioned earlier, we've got so much information, we decided to jettison this last little bit just to get you folks on.
One thing we have, we initially had on tap for you is basically a connection between elements of, basically American political elements that were incredibly bitter about Kennedy's very strong support for civil rights, notably Martin Luther King's efforts in the South in the early 60s, Kennedy, on 2 occasions, called in federal troops to support civil rights actions, and this engendered a tremendous amount of hostility on the part of reactionary elements around the country. And one of the things that we were going to read to you was a portion of a transcript of an interview between an undercover Miami police informant and a states' rights activist, which discussed not only plans to kill President Kennedy from ambush, disassembling a high-powered rifle, then shooting him from ambush in that building, which, of course, is, according to the official version of the assassination, what happened, but it also discusses that basically the real marksman would escape while a patsy was fingered and thrown in jail. And interestingly enough, it linked, in the same discussion as plans to kill Kennedy, they discussed plans to kill Martin Luther King and also talked about the bombing of a church in Birmingham, Alabama in September of 1963, in which 4 little girls died. It was a very famous incident in the course of the civil rights struggles of the 60s, and the same individuals here who were talking about killing Kennedy and Martin Luther King were also discussing who and how the Birmingham bombing occurred. Apparently it was attributed to the use of plastic explosives. So again, there is yet another Kennedy policy, and this was by no means, there are others that we haven't discussed, that engendered not only tremendous hostility, but also led many of the elements opposed to him to threaten Kennedy with death. So there are other things that we haven't had a chance to present. If you'd like to talk about them, give us a call and we can do just that.
All right, very good. And now we do have the phones loaded up.